Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Jason Holley, and we're going to be talking about experiential astrology, which is a dynamic approach that moves simply beyond thinking about astrology to trying to embody its symbols through creative and interactive methods, including making a chart come alive through acting it out in a group setting. So, hey, Jason, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Chris. Great to be here.
Yeah, I am excited about this topic. I've been wanting to talk about this topic for a while because I know this is a significant form of astrology that really developed in the 1970s forward as a more recent development, but it's something that I know is very popular for a period of time, and that yeah, I wanted to find somebody to help walk me through what it's all about and to sort of introduce it to my listeners. So since this is your first time on the podcast, welcome, and yeah, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So experiential astrology, can we start by defining what it is? Did you feel like my definition was okay, or how would you define what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a good working definition. I think the biggest thing I would say about it is that it's about engaging the chart or the horoscope or astrology broadly uh, through means that are not just conceptual or using language or concepts and descriptions, but are actually involving all of our other intelligences. So, if there's the sort of cognitive mental intelligence, that's the languaging mind, that mostly is how I think people learn about astrology, think about astrology, and so on. In an experiential mode of astrology, you're engaging all the different sort of organs of perception and consciousness. So you're giving yourself a chance to experience astrology, not just through ideas about it, but through your own body, like, right, like in a somatic way, or through your senses, through image, through aesthetics, through how you move, how you express, create, relate. It's like all these different ways of knowing, different ways of experiencing that are, not they're not as linear. That they kind of go new places, different places, and you're looking at, like, again, it's sort of a full consciousness approach. That gives astrology all new ways, gives astrological symbols lots of ways to become known, is maybe a way I would say it.
I like that. Yeah, because I mean, astrology otherwise is a pretty intellectual topic. It always has been in terms of you looking at like numbers. In some
Mhm.
instances, like, if people are using like ephemerides, you're literally looking at like a page of just numbers, and or you're looking at charts, like two-dimensional charts. And but there are lots of other senses, besides that we don't use oftentimes for astrology in the world that could be useful as ways to connect with the chart in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. And really, arguably, it's a return to the modes of consciousness that would have ever had an astrology or astrological way of experiencing life. Meaning, when people were considerably more connected to the natural cycles, more connected to the night sky, more embodied, more, available to that, and maybe less oriented towards abstraction and that kind of thing. Of course, astrology came up in that way, but it's a little bit of a return to an embodied, embedded way that would experience this very directly, and so it's opening us up to an entire different way of experiencing symbolism that isn't limited to what language can convey, or limited to what we can think about. And like you said, with what you just said about it's the math and the kind of the sort of person who feels like they can even do this is gets a bit limited because of the way, if it is just presented as ephemerides and geometries and so on, then this is a what mode of astrology. This is a way of astrology that works with all kinds of other ways of knowing, and all kinds of different intelligences that maybe don't operate that way. Like we all know, like when we're at conferences in astrology, my feeling is often there are many, many, many people in the room who are just as deep in astrological knowing as I am. I'm not up there because I necessarily know other things. It's because I have a way of sharing it with language and I can work with that world. But often I feel some people in the audience often have it way more of an embodied or intuitive or various ways of understanding things, but it's just not necessarily, linearized. And so part of
Mhm.
this is it makes astrology accessible. I mean, that's one of the big benefits of working this way is that it really allows people to step into astrology, be their own astrologer in that, in the moment.
That makes sense. Yeah. And externalizing something versus like internalizing or just having your brain, but sometimes different ways of trying to learn something. Like I think everybody has that experience, even just growing up in like school, like elementary school or something like that, that there's different ways of learning things that can be more engaging for your subject matter.
Mm.
And maybe accessing some of those can be helpful sometimes. Because like, what are some of the other senses that we have besides just like using our brain or using language? We also have things like touch and other
Mm.
senses like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, even just, one of the things we're really talking about with this is, for instance, I mean, one of the ways that will probably be relatable to people, watching this show, when you are sitting with someone and you have a spontaneous feeling in your body, like a sensation of some kind, and, one way would be, oh, don't pay attention to that, stay with the numbers, stay with the delineation. But in this mode of thinking, actually, you would wonder about, what is that sensation? What's being communicated through that sensation in your body? What are you seeing? Or you notice something in the room that you didn't notice before. You see something. So we're making ourselves available to all sorts of different data, I guess you could say, that will allow us to go places that our minds can't really map because they aren't even symbolized yet. Like you can't really speak to it until it occurs, because it hasn't
Mm,
yet been put into language. It's come in a different way, and often the
right.
the things that really often the stuff that people maybe I don't know about need to hear, but maybe that they're there to hear. Let's say it that way. The things they're there to hear often have to kind of come in through these other ways, like because there's not yet it's not yet in shared understanding, so it kind of comes in the back door, so to speak. Because I would say that all astrologers are doing experiential astrology. Like not consciously, not on purpose necessarily, but all of us are inside our own subjective experience when we're giving readings, when we're sitting with people, when we're writing, you and I talking, we're always inside that, and our experience, our many parts of our experience are making decisions for us, even if we think that all we're doing is just following the rule or following the technique. You're still drawn to certain things. You're still, forgot this thing, whatever it might be. There's never, there's never a moment where your experience isn't guiding. So in a way, what we're doing with experiential astrology is sort of saying, okay, you know, technique and delineation, and it gives you the orienting to where you are in time and space. Um, and it's the beginning of the astrological moment, rather than the end of the astrological moment. It's the beginning. It gives you, gets you on the lay of the land. Now you're on the land. What happens next? What do you feel? What do you relate to? What seems important because something comes up? And I think a lot of astrologers who imagine that the technique they're using is why they get such great results, I have a feeling it's often more about that they have been living on this land of astrology for a very long time. It's sort of, they feel it in their bones, they feel it in their body. Somebody starts speaking. They may not make the conscious thing of like, oh, because that tone of voice, now I'm drawn to look at Venus. But I think it goes on constantly for people. And so what we're doing in experiential astrology is actually saying, let's do that consciously. Let's open that whole field up consciously. Like let's have this be not just a technical discussion, but a phenomenological discussion where it's like arising, like a shared co-discovery of meaning, versus I am delineating to you as if objective, because that's automatically not quite true, right?
Yeah, I as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate that more that I didn't appreciate as much when I was younger. I went to an optometrist actually yesterday, and he hit me with I just turned 40, and he hit me with at your age such and such starts happening. And I was like, wow, I was not anticipating that. But one positive thing about being at my advanced age is I have racked up a lot of experience of experiencing what different transits are like, so that
Hmm.
I have like a feeling in my body of like
Mm.
what a Mars opposite Mars transit is like, or it's like I
Yeah.
have a feeling of in my body of like what my Saturn return was like, and the
Hmm.
feeling that that invokes from like living through that time frame, that time
Hmm.
period, as well as seeing all of my friends or seeing other people live through that. That hits you on a core level that how, despite how much my younger 20-year-old like hot shit astrologer self would have hated to hear this, that the older you get, like you really do, there's something about the passage of time and the experience of astrology when it happens or as it's happening that you can't replicate, and that is missing from your sort of knowledge banks until you experience some of those transits. Because astrology, while you can do it theoretically and you can learn so much, there is a different side to experiencing something rather than just thinking about it or knowing it abstractly.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Having also received many of those at your age things.
Nice.
But one of the metaphors, and for me, a metaphor is one of the most helpful experiential astrology ways, right? Because people like Hillman and others say that soul communicates through image or through metaphor. One that is often there for me is thinking of us as astrologers as sort of like, stewards of this landscape of astrology, this land or this dreamscape of astrology. Like we hang out there, we have an active relationship with it, we tend it, we cultivate it, we're in a kind of constant relation. And that when you are meeting with people and you're kind of like walking on that land with them, and you develop a familiarity. Like you could say that that knowing that predictive work often comes from just like, I've lived here. I know that animal comes and drinks from this water on this at this time of day. It's kind of how it works. Like, and you are working from that set of familiar associations, which again, the technical pieces immediately help to orient, like, okay, I'm on this version of the land. I'm, this in this situation. But it's not just your ability to read the map, it's your experience walking the territory. Like that is equally or more helpful in really co-creating meaning. And I would say divination, revelation, these are big words, but I think that is how that happens. There is a way that we have, what we've learned from the books, from the techniques and all of that, but it's often the turn towards the subjective that brings it to life, right? That sort of animates it, for both you and the other person.
For sure. So let's talk a little bit about the history of experiential astrology, just to give us like a foundation for everything. So, what was the like time frame for the development of this? It was in the like 1970s.
Yeah, I mean that's at least what I know about. Again, I think one thing I wanted to say as we started was just that there's so many people doing versions of experiential astrology, and I think they are mostly not at a well-known level, right? There are therapists who use it. There are, people who use plant medicine with astrology. There's all many different people out there doing it. So but in terms of having a kind of a naming for it, and in people really getting into it, I think it's the 70s and 80s where we really see this kind of emergence of people doing that. It certainly is a kind of a natural outgrowth of humanistic types of astrology, or psychological astrology. But for sure, it's not limited to that. But that's what was a lot of what was going on at the time. And
Right.
you
And
know,
also
yeah.
even just that generation of astrologers, the especially like the Pluto and Leo generation, that were like the baby boomers that were born in the 1940s, that came into their own in like the 1960s and 70s. That was like
Hmm.
the hippie generation. It seems like that was both the period in which there was a real push towards a more psychological astrology, but
Hmm.
also experimenting with a bunch of different like modalities and different things to sort of like push the limits of what you could do with astrology.
Yeah, like and just the whole notion of self-expression, that was a really big thing, really open it up, get it out there. And then by the 80s, that starts to be also about recognizing trauma, recognizing difficult things and wanting to go into that in a deeper way, and catharsis as a kind of an ideal, kind of peaks, right? This is also the time where you have all these talk shows coming out and that kind of thing, where people are really putting their experience out into the world. And that isn't really the only way to think about experiential astrology, that it always has to be kind of out and in a group. But that is, one of the major ways. And it was, I think, then especially, one of the things that was going on is that there was an experiential track at the UX sometimes, definitely in like 1998, and actually Barbara Schermer in her Astrology Alive books mentions that it was something that was almost always there in one way or another. And then in terms of some astrologers that people would know, who, again, people don't really always become known around this. They become known for their text or for their other contributions, but often how they've arrived at those is through experiential methods. So one person whom I is Melanie Reinhardt, who is pretty well known for her work on Chiron. And she was someone who and worked with Howard Susportis, right? And they did experiential work of things like Astrodrama. Melanie still does art making processes with people. So they were involved. Jeff Jar and Rick Levine both did lots of that, and Rick still does. Lots of what we probably would call in the astrodrama category, the kind of enactment that you were describing, the kind of get up and just play the planet, become the planet. And Brian Clark, who's in Australia, the Chiron Center, which was, sort of very focused on psychological astrology. They did a lot of work with like astrodrama, with role play, and so this is, something going on all over. And then, one that comes to mind, very meaningfully right now, because he's recently passed, is Michael Luton, who, wasn't necessarily doing, astrodrama in that same way, but was doing dramatic astrology, creating performances, spontaneous, seemingly spontaneous performances, and inspired by theater, inspired by actually, in his case, I know it's also inspired by a relational psychotherapeutic orientation. So you have
Right.
a lot of people, who were and are, involved in this. Another would be Patricia Walsh, who's an evolutionary astrologer and has a program on this, as well as people, who are not necessarily in the same astrological orbits, but there are some very significant online communities. One called Embodied Astrology, for instance, which is out there, where they regularly do somatic awareness processes with astrology and so on. So there's quite a it's a very wildly diverse, alive way. And Barbara Schermer's book, it was called Astrology Alive. And she would also say, and connects this back, that yes, our modern mode of it, since the 70s, but then of course this is in many ways, if you really track back, Marsilio Ficino would be seen as an experiential astrologer with a sort of dialogue, the engagement, or you could follow yourself back to, or follow us back to, situations like in Eleusis in Greece, where, there were initiatory rites where they do mythodrama and, sort of dramatize these experiences together. So it's really a very long lineage, in that sense. But there is definitely a modern reimagining that I think is what, what I would say is called experiential astrology at this point.
Sure. So let's talk about one of the core pieces of it, because I want to center it initially around that to define something that people might not be familiar with at all. And then we can go outside of that or talk about the other pieces of it. But one of the
Sure.
ways I'm primarily familiar with experiential astrology at this point is at astrology conferences. Sometimes people that do experiential astrology, I've seen them one of the things is astrodrama, and the
Mhm.
version of it that I'm familiar with is like a group of people will stand around in a circle, and then different people, they'll recreate somebody's birth chart and have
Mhm.
somebody stand in the center of the chart,
Mhm.
and then different people will stand in different places and will act out and represent each of the planets. And
Mhm.
then they will talk, and sometimes they'll talk to each other or they'll talk to the person,
Mhm.
and there'll be this whole process of sort of like acting out the birth chart. And that's
Mhm.
something that I think from the 1970s and 80s and 90s forward started becoming a thing that would sometimes happen at conferences. I think there was a video from the first UAC that I
Mhm.
re-released on my YouTube channel that the documentary filmmakers allowed me to re-release from I think 1986. And I'm
Mhm.
pretty sure at one point in that you see Barbara Schermer or somebody leading
Mhm.
like an experiential astrology circle of that
Okay.
sort. So
Yeah.
that a good description of astrodrama, or how does astrodrama go?
Yeah, well, I think that, yeah, that is a good description. And actually, Barbara would have called that the living horoscope, that specific exercise, because that's one of many ways you could do astrodrama. But that's a very specific, mode where you just literally gather people around and have them be the planets. And as you said, they interact. They're in a way, in a sense, though, astrodrama is sourced from a lot of different places. And there are, many different modes that you could, think from. So what I mean by that is that, so when they call it astrodrama, they're usually sourcing from psychodrama, something that was developed by Jacob Moreno, who was a contemporary of Freud. And the thing he said, with back to Freud was, who did psychoanalysis, and Moreno called his method psychodrama, right? And so he said to Freud, you encourage people to analyze their dreams. I encourage them to live their dreams, to
Mm,
enact them. Like psychodrama means soul in action. So astrodrama, I think, is very much inspired, particularly from that method. And so the kind of thing you described is possible, where the whole chart is involved. But also, it's very much just a matter of, I think it's actually often more potent and a deeper dive when you just take one or two things and place them in interaction. Like when you take a really key aspect from someone's horoscope, or you just progress a planet and have, you sort of define a part of the ground as Pisces. Let's say it's a progressing planet from Pisces to Aries. Like you define part of the ground as Pisces and then another part as Aries, and they just walk and notice what happens as they do that. Um,
mm,
so there's so many different ways you can, move into this. You can also use props. You can have people dress up in different ways. I sometimes have essential oils that are associated with the planets, and people, use those to kind of induce that, they follow that. So it can get, there's so many different ways that you can do it. And you can do it with one person. You don't have to be in a group, right? You could set up two chairs and have somebody go over there and be their Saturn, and then move to the other chair and be the moon, and do a dialogue back and forth that way. Um,
mm,
and so it doesn't have to be the larger. I actually think we'll get into it in terms of what makes this effective or less effective. But when there's all kinds of people doing all kinds of things, it often is more of an excitability factor and playful, but the capacity for depth is frequently it's a little bit like if you tell everyone in a consultation, if you tell someone in a consultation every single thing you can see, that's usually a less meaningful consultation than if you choose some of the most important things and stay there.
mm,
So it's very similar here. Like if you pack it with everything, the capacity to drop in and really, go somewhere that you didn't already know, um, it's not as much there. And that's what these methods can do, right? They can let you go places that you weren't already going to go. Like that's probably a really important thing. It's like, when you do have those two people and the planets, they're going to end up saying things that nobody expected to hear, from
mm,
that planet or from that place. So yeah, just to say, astrodrama can be sourced with psychodrama methods, but also things like people might know family constellation work, right? So in that kind of work, it's a different mode. Like psychodrama is about sourcing something from somebody's experience and making it everybody's experience. So taking your horoscope and turning it into, for this hour, we are all in your horoscope, right? It's sort of doing that. But we're informed by you. But in constellation ways of working with groups, you don't really even need to know anything. You just tell people to step in and assume that everything they're going to do is the planets. So someone doesn't need any astrology knowledge to do it. You just say, to a person who doesn't know astrology, you're going to come in at this angle, Mercury and Aries, and they don't know what that means. But you're trusting that there's a field that has constellated and they will go there. So like in family constellation, that happens where people don't tell you their life story, right? And then you play their father in a family constellation. You just step in, and then we trust whatever you do is the communication about the father. So that's a little bit of a different method, but it's still in the same category, right? Where it is relying on the symbolic field is probably the best language I can say. That you're entering the living field, the living symbolic field.
Okay. Um, let's back up a little bit because I want to
Yeah.
expand on the just like chart process more, because there's always something I was curious about in terms
Mm.
of what are the instructions? Let's just, for the purpose of this, because I know it's more complex, there's different things that you could do, but let's say they are recreating a person's birth chart in a large
Mhm.
group standing around a circle, and you have, let's say, most of the main planets. What are the instructions, and how would the process of that go? Like what would be like a very
Mm.
basic version of that, of how that would go?
Mhm. I think that there's going to be a little bit of an initial educational moment to explain to the people what they're doing, that they're not that the objective is not think about what a Mercury and Aries would say. I mean, they don't think about what they're going to say anyway, but you know what I mean. Think about what X would do. You're not trying to do that. You're not trying to just replicate, the things you've learned. It's more like feel yourself as I don't know why Mercury and Aries is the one, but feel yourself as Mercury and Aries. Like, what does that feel like in your body? How do you think what would be the posture that Mercury and Aries might have, right? What
Mm,
are you noticing differently? Your perception will change when you're in a role. Certain things will become, kind of like when we shift roles in regular consciousness. When we're upset, we see things and that we didn't see before. When you're afraid, you hear more vividly. So in a similar
okay.
way, so we'd help them into the role, and that takes a minute, like to help them drop out of what they think it's supposed to be, and into the living field of it. Then in that,
So it's not
oh
just
yeah,
about, so it's not just a passive thing of the person in the center who's having their chart being read, learning things about their chart, but the people involved are also having a sort of experience as well.
absolutely. Thanks for saying that, because that's exactly it. It's very educational, right? Like I have learned a lot of my astrology through role taking, because you get inside of the thing and you learn about it in ways that, as you were saying, it sort of creates a body signature in a way. Like you're like, oh, that's what this is. Oh, that's what's going on right now.
Mm,
So it's an amazing educational method. So whether, we can use it with people just, as you said, exploring their charts, but it is really powerful education, and it's also education in psychic flexibility, meaning you begin to be able to consciously shift in and out of planets and consciously shift, you develop a reflexive capacity when you do enough of this work, that when you're sitting with people in consultation, you just naturally role reverse with a planet in their chart. You just almost become that Saturn for a minute, just to feel like, what is that like to be, receiving that ray from Jupiter, or whatever it is. It's like you kind of just find yourself in there. So yeah, people are really being encouraged to really feel into the role. Then in the version that you described, what I would probably usually do is begin by letting the planets sort of introduce themselves, say a little bit, like something just a little. Um, and always like the Jupiter won't obey that or something. They have to break the container, but in general, you're gonna kind of elicit a little bit of their experience, and they might, in the way you were describing that one, they would maybe speak to the person whose horoscope it is. But to me, what becomes most interesting is when we have them speaking to each other eventually. But initially, there'd
mm,
be some introduction. Again, I don't that method where they're all together, it's not something I honestly use much because I think it's a highly complex, which is good if everybody can really hang there. So what I would prefer in an enactment with that is just, the Saturn and the moon and really make it an in-depth conversation there. Like one of my favorite things to do when somebody takes the role of Saturn, we'll start there that or wherever we start. But let's say we started with Saturn and we kind of interview Saturn a little bit. What's it like to be here? What are you most concerned with? What are you most trying to get accomplished around here?
Mm.
Um, etc. And they might be bending up because again, they're going to let their body do it. So I might say, I notice you're kind of hunched over. And I might even say things that person isn't doing on purpose. Like invariably, even people, this is where it's fun with people who don't know astrology too, because invariably they'll come in and do things that they don't think they're acting there, but it'll be the archetype. So like one that comes to mind vividly, like a woman who didn't know anything about astrology coming in, and she was to be Jupiter in Pisces, and we weren't even to her yet, and she just was like floating away in the room, like she just like, it felt like, oh, she's in a role, like, she's like wanting to get a different view, and she's kind of like trancing out a little bit. Um, and that was great. It's like, okay, you're in the role. So then though, the interesting thing is once you have one of them in, bring the other in, and you can immediately ask the first planet, what was that like when the moon stepped in? What did you feel? Now that you're feeling your aspectual relation to this moon, let's say it's in opposition, but what is that like for you? And, oh, I feel too seen, or I feel like that person's so needy. I don't want to deal with all their needs. I wish they'd just get over it, whatever it is. And it'll come pretty quickly once somebody's kind of in there. And then all sorts of information starts to arise. So you have to work, if you're the director, you are spending some time really making sure people have dropped in. And because the tricks of these methods, anytime we go to the subjective, right, is that you're bringing whatever you're bringing. So, in other words, what if you're not speaking from their Saturn, but you're actually just speaking from, the day you had yesterday or something? The thing that,
Right.
you know what I mean? Like the risk of giving primacy to the subjective is that it can be hard to discern, are we in the astrology or are we somewhere else? And that is definitely a limitation of this, but it's something you can work with. But it's like, it can depart, and so you're trying to really feel that, and it's very much the felt sense that we were talking about before. Where you can just feel the coherence of the role. It's cohering or it isn't. But you do kind of have to check that. And then once you have, they will move into spontaneous interaction often, right? And then say things that are kind of unbelievable in terms of like the moon suddenly says out of nowhere, this reminds me of my mother, in role. And then, the person whose horoscope it is watching this and it's like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what happened. She always criticized me, whatever it might be. This is an amazing thing that happens kind of consistently.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine in some instances that might be kind of like intense, or that the person having their chart acted out might in some instances have kind of like an intense reaction to that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's again, and I think we'll probably get into this, but we really do have to know what are the boundaries of the work, what are people ready for, what's the warm up, because this is again the beauty of experiential work is that it is going to break us out of a drier, this and this and that. It's going to break us into some implicit material that has not yet been explicated. It's going to surface things. It's often a way that dissociated material will come in, meaning material that's sort of out of awareness from the person, especially if somebody else is playing your planets, right? They're going to not have the same character organization that you do that keeps that quiet and they're going to say something that you're like that you don't even authorize yourself to say or think.
Mm.
So it really can go to these types of places, but there are ways to slow things down. Slow is one of, anyway, maybe we'll come to that. But in this Saturn moon thing that we were talking about, you can also have the person move into the role of the planet, right? I can, what's called role reversal. I could move the actor out of the moon and put that person in the moon. Now you're going to be the moon. And so that they can actually experience it from there.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
I don't, yeah. Mhm.
So one of the things you said is that so there is somebody there like yourself who's acting as like a director of this
Mhm.
entire thing so that it's being guided by like a central figure.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's very, very important to have someone charged with that role. And frankly, in group process, it's almost always good to have two people, one who is directing and one who's just kind of watching everybody and, being available for support and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Not again, we've in my characteristic way, we've gone straight to a painful Saturn moon opposition. So they don't always have to go to, intense dark places. But
Sure.
that's not, and it's not psychotherapy, right? That's not what we're doing. We're doing experiential astrology, and that is a different thing.
Yeah, like I imagine, like somebody has like a very nice like Venus Jupiter trine in their charts, and like
Mhm,
those two planets being in a trine really like vibing and like getting along
mhm.
very well and acting that out.
Yeah, I mean that's often something that is a really good idea is to begin processes like this with what we would call resourcing, like things that kind of help you remember your resourcedness, help you know your resilience, your capacities, your playfulness, whatever that might be. But what I will say is that these methods might surface something else going on in that trine, that is not necessarily all good and all that. As we know, at least from my perspective, the way that trine operates could be in service of some things and not in service of others, and it might, that might be shown, by this. One of the things I was going to say too is that what I really love about this process is that very much like the old astrology texts, we are treating the planets as sort of as beings. We're giving them subjectivity. We're not calling them psychological functions. We're not using all that language that psychology overlays on it. And we're also not assuming that they are all about you and that it's all your psyche. I mean, I think some people are assuming that in this work, but that's not really, I mean, that's one of the most attractive things for me when the Hellenistic material came and the way the planets are being described. I have an agenda, not first person, but there was a clear multiplicity, multi-beingness, and that this is the hour of your birth. This is the forces around you or that are there. They're not all you necessarily. That's not how we have to look at it. So this, when we do
Right.
this,
They're being personified in some way. And that
yeah.
kind of goes back. There's almost this legalistic language that Hellenistic astrology, I think, may have interpreted from
Mm,
the earlier Mesopotamian tradition of like the planets are all like standing around, like having a
mm,
conversation about this person's destiny before they're born or when they're born, and
mm,
talking about what their fate will be or something like
mm.
that. And I can't think of a better way to like picture that sort of process than have people actually act it out.
Yeah, I mean, and really to experience the multiplicity of the self. Like one of the most powerful things about the horoscope as a therapist, and I don't do therapy right for a while, but as someone who did for 18 years, the power of astrology in my work that was most important is that the minute you look at a horoscope, right, you are looking at multiplicity. Like it immediately announces that the person whose sky this is many things and it has many things affecting them, like it's multiplicity. And I think nowadays there's more of an understanding of the multiplicity of the psyche. People do parts work and inner child and internal family systems, all these approaches to the psyche. But so this is immediately setting up that thing of when we say when we feel ourselves arguing with ourselves, one way to look at that is one planet is wanting this and another wants that, and that's the conversation you're in. So with astrodrama in particular, you can extrovert that conversation. And then the other part of this is that it also means you can move to um, creative reimaginings, right? It means that you can sort of show the situation, and you then also, it means that other responses might come, or preferences, or the, it's one of the things I really like about it is that, in astrology, for me at least, there are no prescriptions in the sky. There's no thing you're supposed to do from astrology. I mean, this different astrologers would feel differently. Um, but I don't want people to balance something or to go to this node or whatever, all the prescriptive things. I think what experiential astrology does is lay out the experience. And then, however, things do emerge, right? Like information emerges, predictive information emerges. And the next thing to do kind of happens. Like, so it's like you become your own oracle in this process. You don't need the oracle to say, here's what to do or here's what's going to be. It actually emerges spontaneously in the field. Um, and you're allowing it to take its own shape rather than, the director is not really a director, they're really a facilitator. Like they're making it easy for things to have a home here, to express, to share.
Right. It's like you're creating a not a blank slate, but you're creating a place. I want to say not a petri dish, but a place where something can like grow and develop, like a garden that you're trying to like nurture. But then some things are going to grow that are going to be like unexpected or that you may not have anticipated or planned out. It's not like a fully planned out thing, which on the one
Mm-mm.
hand, for me seems like it could be kind of scary sometimes as a facilitator because like you don't know how this is going to go. But
Yeah.
I often find like when I was doing when I first started doing astrology lectures, I would plan everything out ahead of time to the T, and I would avoid doing too much audience interaction just because you never know how that's going to go, and it could go wildly badly.
Mm-hmm.
But then over the years of facilitating like workshops and stuff, I've really come to appreciate um, the magic that can happen of the spontaneity of especially like talking to people about their charts or having people
Mm-hmm.
share their chart experiences. Some
Mm-hmm.
truly magical things can come out of that that you wouldn't anticipate. And I'm sure similarly here when you do this, while maybe occasionally you have one that doesn't go as well as you would have
Oh yeah.
hoped, that yeah, that for the most part, the magic field that creates can sometimes spontaneously have some pretty beautiful outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's what happens. But I but no question, you saw me like I have an almost physical response when you're like, yeah, sometimes it doesn't go because you as the practitioner now become more vulnerable. There's an invulnerability to sitting behind our notes and just saying this. Like we are not part of the field, or we are, of course, but we feel separate. And we can make our pronouncements, right? And when you're doing this work, I always teach in my practitioner programs and stuff. I say to people, your very first job is availability to the field. Your very first job is you need to be affected by things. Like you have to turn on your full system if you want the client to turn on their full system. So you have to be feeling what you're feeling, your emotions, your sensations, your stray thoughts, your anger, whatever is around. It doesn't mean you're going to enact it, but you really have to kind of have it all turned and activated. And it is likely to go somewhere. I mean, I hope it will go somewhere I don't predict. I really smiled when you said that because I think if you do this work, you want to have a sort of thrill about that. Like my psychodrama trainer, because I do, psychodrama as well. Like, she used to always say, in every good psychodrama, as the director, there's always a moment. If it's good, if it's gonna be good, there's gonna be what she called an oh shit moment, like a moment when you're like, what do I do with it? Like something emerges, right? And it's like, what's this? And so that developing a tolerance for not knowing, developing a tolerance for suffering, like to hang out with something that's hard rather than try to fix it and resolve it. Um, some of the disciplines are really about, I don't know, this language is overused now, but like they're really about space holding. They're really about holding the field, staying with, hold on a minute, slow down, see what is next to emerge. And so, you know, comfort with uncertainty is one of the hardest ones with astrologers, because a lot of people got into astrology because they wanted more certainty about life. They wanted to know what's happening and what's going to happen. So it kind of can go against that orientation that a lot of us might have that are even attracted to astrology, because it says, don't try to figure it out. Don't try to make anything happen. Just stay with, be available, help it, and mediate it. Give it levels of mediation. Mediation is one of the biggest, I always think of Mercury. Mercury, of course, is the ruler of astrology, and also I think of Mercury as the great mediator, the translator, the one who moves between. And so one of the frameworks that I use a lot in my work is when it comes to archetypes or planets, signs, whatever it might be. One way to think about archetypal energy is like electricity. When you plug your lamp into the wall, right here in the US, it's 110, other places 220, whatever it might be. But about over at the power plant, right there, the electricity is at like 880 or even whatever the double of that is, 1760. And so what they have to do is they have to step that energy down, right? They're called transformers that step the energy down so that by the time it meets your wall, it's something that your device can metabolize. It can use it for creative action. So archetypal process is quite similar. Like if you amplify, sometimes we do need to amplify, but if you amplify to like 880, right, you're in probably something like psychosis, where the archetype is just totally in charge. It's almost like a kind of possession situation. And of course, that's going on in the world all the time. When you're totally owned, you're totally possessed by a planet, or, it makes me think of how they're called graha, in the Vedic way, like that grabs you, you're just owned. And so in those situations, a lot of times people come to us and read it for consultation because life has gotten at that level, or maybe 440, like they're doing things and like, why am I doing this? Or things are going on in your life. And what a reading does actually often is it steps that down to like the 110, where you can actually talk about it, symbolize it, give it a name, give it a shape, have a sense of its time and place. And because what usually people do at 440 or 880 is just go to zero. They're just like, I just have to shut this down. But then they lose the play space, right? They lose the whatever's trying to happen there isn't allowed to happen. So a lot of what we're doing is stepping down when it's overwhelming and stepping up when it's not being heard or recognized. If everything's always at 110, meaning, you're just kind of using language and not really feeling much, then that's when we need the amplification. And experiential astrologies usually are going to be methods of amplifications, right? Where you can kind of let the archetype come in a little bit more and remove your regular mode of consciousness so that it can speak a little bit more. But we don't want to just sort of, open it up into full on, things. People need to, so a lot of the skill that is involved is this mediation, which I think is an inherently mercurial, stepping down and up the energies. If you think in myth, what does Mercury do? Moves between the upper and the middle and the lower. It brings the messages and translates them right into things we can metabolize. Like in Greek stories, if you see the god directly, that's not a good thing. As a rule, that's not that leads to destruction. So the god has to be stepped down. And you could say the same with the planets. So we're looking for degrees of mediation. And there's different thresholds in a different moment. It might be the right thing to really amp it up. But generally, what I would say to people is to go really slow and subtle with this type of work. It's very powerful. It doesn't have to be big and dramatic and screaming and dancing, and it can be very, very subtle, small movements, one line, one sentence, from the planet. Just and then if you sense that more wants to happen, you can kind of open it up a little. I hope that makes sense. Like that mediation thing for me is the key, actually. It creates this secured symbolizing field. Like you need a secure field for this work.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And that role of you as the director to modulate things in terms of the energy and the intensity. And I like that you're using some of those analogies because it's very evocative of the chart we ended up using today through kind of
Mhm.
just a sort of sequence of chance, of not super far planned in advance, but we
Mhm.
ended up with this chart today for starting, where we're doing this experiential discussion on the full moon in Leo that just
Mhm.
occurred, that was square Uranus. And I just like that you're using some of those
Mhm.
analogies about like the energy or
Mhm.
electricity, and having to like modulate that within the dynamic of a,
Mhm.
you know, of an astrodrama, of acting these things out. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else we should expand on. You mentioned doing progressions, but so this is something where you could also do like a person's transits at the time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and a lot of different ways you could do that. But it's easy enough, right? If you're speaking about the enactment part, and
Mm,
meaning, you could bring a planet in, and then you can have someone else be the transit and literally walk by, or even station and retrograde back and do 3 or 5 hits if it's an outer planet, right? Like,
right,
um, and feel those sequentially. And both people, a lot of it is like, just, it could, again, this doesn't have to get really big. It could just be one's going to stand there and one's going to walk back and forth, and maybe they'll say a few words of what it feels like as they approach, right? What does it feel like when
right.
they're right there? And you can really slow it down, and just that will often open up some things, right? It's just, even just that. And it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be, oh, go ahead, yeah.
I love that so much, just because I'm thinking about like this Venus retrograde that's happening right now that I've been spending a lot of time researching. And it's like you have Venus past Saturn this first time, and
Mhm.
literally you could just have somebody saying, "Hey, Saturn," and you know, Venus and
Mhm.
Saturn have their little initial discussion, and they think it's over, and Venus like keeps moving. But then, you know, Venus does a U-turn and comes back, and then has that second connection with Saturn where they reconnect, and then eventually there'll be a third one after the direct station as well. And something as
Mhm.
simple as acting that out could really help people understand the astronomy much more, for one,
Mm.
but also some of the dynamic field of like what's going on as it's part of an ongoing process, rather than just seeing it as a single like hit of a transit or something like that.
Mhm. Absolutely, yes. And by the way, this is where genuinely predictive things emerge, right? This is where someone's like, they're not trying to predict, they're not thinking about what would happen. They're just reporting what is going on. They're just saying it. But those things, the person, sometimes it's good to have a second person, not just the person whose horoscope it is, but also a second person who's writing some notes or something, so that they can just really be in it, the other one. But to sort of phrases that are there, and then I will, as all astrologers do, but the kinds of notes that I get have to do with these processes. But it's things like, you wouldn't believe how this came out that way. When somebody trips, when they're doing it, right, accidentally, like they walking doing the transit and they fall over or something. And then someone says, the day it happened, I fell over. I mean, it can be quite literal, of course, it's also symbolic always, but it's very, and then, it's not just enactments with a body, many, many other methods possible here, right? Where people, you know, um, make art, right? Or do writing exercises where they write as the planet. Like you can have people. I do a lot of the writing stuff, so, because part of my, major part of my work in astrology has been mythology. That's just been the language of it, one of the languages that really speaks to me. And so a lot of times we'll take the planetary, I'll tell a story that is told by the Greeks or the Romans about a planet just as a start. Like, and that's, even storytelling itself can be experiential astrology. It all depends, right? Like, the difference between talking and storytelling is that storytelling invokes an experience. It's not just describing, you're invoking something. And this is a very different use of language. And so people sort of start to feel the story. They start to see, this is happening. And And then you invite them to be the character and describe more of what they were going through than what, say, the myth tells you, or you give them an opportunity to kind of expand on it, and then connect that with the figure in the chart, or the transiting figure that's coming by. So, writing is a way. Art making is a thing I do a lot of, and I have a couple of images. I don't know if we can share them, but I mean, I know I can, but I don't think we have time. But the image making and image working with images is a really, really alive way to because when you create imagery, invariably things are there that you didn't intend to create, and those are often the information, right? Like there's what you did that you knew you were doing, but there's always other things that, especially if other people see it, that links and connections that come out.
Mm.
So these methods are there's just many different things, and even just following your body, like is enough. Meaning a sensation that is arising or something like that. But yeah, you can do trend. You can also you can definitely you could do something with perfections, right? You could do something where you have this experience where let's say that you've got the Taurus houses, the perfection house with Venus, and then you have the Gemini year coming, or the Mercury year coming. You could have the person standing in there, and then sort of like a baton handoff, from one to the other, like, okay, or put a spotlight or something on, like change the spotlight onto the other person, and or give them some sort of a physical thing that says, I'm the one you should pay attention to, and ask them, how does it feel? Like, what's the focus like? There's again, all of these can be brought to life, and once you've been doing this for a while, you come up with your own little tricks and things you like to do in that, as the so-called director. Different people want to focus in different ways. I use a lot of well, not these days, but dance is another really, really potent mode where you have music, and then you can say to people, like, after the music starts, and you have them move, and even a person who doesn't dance, that's something important actually. um, with all experiential methods, they can always be brought to whatever is within a person's comfortable range of expression, and also even within the range of their physical abilities. Like, so no matter what is happening, like no matter what's being invited, you can help a person find their place with it. Like, so like if people don't like to dance, right, which is very much, that's not rare. uh, I can have them just do like this with their hands or something. They can just do that. Like we can always work within the role repertoire that the person has available. Of course, we always want to invite a little stretch, but because a stretch will get you past what you already always do. But we don't want you to rubber band out, like, yeah, because that doesn't go well.
Right. I mean, how would you deal with a person like myself that's more Saturnian? I'm a little bit more of a square, a little bit more inhibited when it comes to like maybe acting things out in person. Like, how is that something I'd be able to work around, or how does that work? Like, do you have to be like a super dramatic person to participate in this?
No, and so this is a really a meaningful thing, for a couple of reasons, right? Like, so if we are doing psychodrama in a group, a person, you can do it one of two ways, right? You can have people volunteer for roles, like I'll be Saturn, but you can also have the protagonist, the person whose horoscope it is, you can have them pick someone. So,
Mm,
generally there's going to be what we call tele, like a felt sense of, like, I mean, I think people would pick you for Saturn sometimes, right? Like,
right.
that seems likely to me. So,
Yeah.
so then your way of being is already correct. Like, there's a little bit of an assumption in this that that's that's going to be just right no matter how you play it, whether you're big with it, whether you're not. And then on some of these other methods where, there's like, you don't have to be an extrovert and be out in the center. There's always a way to meet maybe you're not going to take roles if you're really profoundly introverted,
Mhm.
but you can still be sort of checking in with body, or we can put you in a more observational, yeah, a planet that seems, a planet that maybe is in a more observational mode. It's there's always a way. And then with movement or with dance or that kind of thing, again, everything can be very subtle and low key. It doesn't have to be, you know, doing it all over. But what I do like to do and I do a lot of it online now, you know, with people all over the world in little like small groups. I have like 14-person groups usually. And so what I will do is like play some music, and the nice thing online is that people don't have to have others watching them move, and that gives a lot of people a little more freedom. But and then they'll be moving, and then I'll say, "What planet do you think is dancing right now? Who's moving you?" So we don't even set it up in advance. And most people will feel like, oh, I'm kind of like doing this thing. I'm in this Neptunian way, or I'm like really staccato and I'm in Mars. And then I might ask them, for instance, to amplify that, make it a little more Mars, or if it's Saturn and you're barely moving, get even more, you know, frozen. Um, and, you know, we'll just sort of play with it that way. And then if you're in a group situation in person, it can be very fun to just tell people to become a planet and then eventually have them pair to dance, and they're essentially transiting each other. And they don't even tell each other maybe at the moment which planet they each are. Like they just kind of do their thing. And then or maybe they do. Again, all of these have different learning values. Like to not know and just be in it really has a lot of discovery in it when you talk about it later. And because nobody's conditioned by anything, you know, what they're thinking. But maybe sometimes it's good to know. So, you know, you can do it in a lot of different ways. You can have people, one of the best ways to teach diurnal motion as the foundation of the houses is to have people move around and feel what it's like to be a planet who just peeked up over the ascendant after 12 hours hidden. You know, after 12 hours underground, you've just come up, and no wonder the 12th house is a hard place to live. Like you've come up, you're saturated with, I mean, this might not be how it would unfold. Everybody would do their own, but you know, you've been under there, and you're just coming up, and you're sort of faced with visibility. You know, you're faced with this, and what do you do? Like you've been in the other worlds, and so, and then do you feel the excitement of the climb through the 11th house? Can you feel Jupiter, you know, urging you on? Um, you know, this is how I've taught like the planetary joys is like go be Jupiter in the 11th and see if it feels pretty gosh darn natural to be in the climb, to be ascending to Olympus, so to speak. Um,
Mm.
what do you feel when you cross the gate of Hades? That's my favorite place. What do you feel when you go from 9 to 8 that way, right? Like you know, there's that a lot of times people feel something draw a pit in their stomach. And by the way, they might not feel these things. They might feel something else. But what I have always found is that if we hang out with whatever they're saying, even if it doesn't seem initially, if it initially seems like that would never happen, like a lot of times in early process, people who know a lot of astrology come into groups like this, and it's hard for them because I remember like someone being upset like because a Mercury was way too emotional or something, and they're like that would never happen. That's not, you know, that's not what Mercury is. Um, and you really have to hang out and be patient. It will almost always reveal its home. You know, meaning it'll almost always curve back in, and you'll see it, but you'll now actually have a more complex view of the archetype. It does not leave the field. And if we as the person present senses that it's departing the field, then we are going to help kind of either A, find out how it's still in the field that we don't yet see, or really help course correct a little bit to, you know, to offer that. But you know, that's always that's a thing. And the other thing is these things can take us to new significations for planets, and you know, not new like radically different, but new images that we haven't had before, or notions, and it will evolve our understanding of the archetype. I really do think this is a research method. It's a heuristic research method, phenomenological research method.
Yeah, I really like what you were saying about acting out the joys or the diurnal rotation, and then
Huh.
just seeing what that looks like and how there could be things that would arise spontaneously as part of that process that you might not think of otherwise, but just by purely putting it in a different sort of relational dynamic between people in different spots geometrically, how
Mhm.
that would evoke something for you that you might not have realized otherwise, or like acting out the thema mundi, or
Mhm.
the domiciles or the exaltations or what have you might evoke different things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is an amazing pedagogical tool. Like this is a way, and it anchors the knowledge in you, so it's not just conceptual. Like it really does give you what I would call kind of planetary empathy, or a really strong sense of psychogeography, with the houses, and like what is this place in the sky? What is this place? What does it feel like when you're there? What, as a planet, what does it feel like to be, excel, like, particularly when you get into the succeedant house and you just feel the force of the engine, starting to drive you to the next angle. It's like people feel that it's spontaneous. I don't have to tell them that's what's going to happen. Their body feels it. Like there's a push that they can feel, or the wandering of the cadence after the angle, um, these, it's a remarkable testament to the potency of our tradition, right? That it actually seems to be, and again, when they're seeming to veer out, that's usually that we're about to learn something that we haven't quite known, and we'll still see how it's inside the significations. Like it's a kind of an amazing process in that way. Like there, that's where the education, I think, is for the whole room. Because one of the things you have to be open to as the person facilitating work like this is that initially that is kind of the so-called, oh shit moment I mentioned my trainer, like where I'm like, whoa, why are you so happy, with Mars hurling rays at you while you're in the sixth house, or what's so great about this? But when you hang with it, and it starts to, show itself. There's a way that you find it, and it actually means too that you're often seeing different layers of the archetypal expression in the person's life. Like you're seeing that at one level, this is how it feels, but at another level, this is a deeper dynamic, it's quite multidimensional, which would be something a lot. One of the things these methods do is that they operate with really powerful psychic authority because the client sources them, right? Like you're not just saying this, 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 this. You are inviting them in, and they bring it. They bring the images. They bring the material. And if it's sourced from your own psyche, it has a very different psychic potential. It empowers the person, and you're not just the wise person who knows things, and they're the idiot who came and asked. But instead, you're both the oracle, right? One of my favorite conceptions. In psychotherapy land, there was this guy, Adolf Guggenbuhl Craig, who wrote about the healer patient archetype, like the dyad. And, the patient comes in with the problem, and the healer, gives the solution. And he was saying how, what probably you need to do is you want to be the patient healer and the healer patient. You want both people to play both roles. And I think that way with the oracle and the querent, that, people get stuck in the oracle, the astrologer is the oracle, and the querent is the one with the questions. But my way of thinking about it would be that the astrologer, should be asking a lot of good questions. You're also the querent, and the client, can also be their own oracle. Or maybe another even way to say it would be that both of you are querents, and the horoscope is the oracle, like, and you're going to engage that experientially. That's the way that it breaks this model that you are the one who has all the knowledge, and you have to, and it also creates enormous performance expectations for the astrologer. Like you're supposed to know everything, and it actually admits, like, we do not know anything, except we know how to orient ourselves in place and time. We know very well. We've been doing it over and over again. We've got multiple ways to orient. We're like, okay, I know where and when we are, where and when we are. Now though, what the meaning or the divination or the whatever can't is going to emerge at the point of encounter with, with the with symbolism.
That makes sense.
Um,
So one last point I wanted to mention or ask about actually before we moved on was the application. Could you also apply this dynamic to like synastry, like acting out the synastry between two people?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I have.
Okay.
And actually that's a very good one, because if you have them take the roles in each other's charts, then you're developing empathy for one another, right? Like you are
Mm,
seeing the world through my eyes. Like, you know how that thing I do always gets on your nerves, and we sort of realize, oh, that's, your, I don't know, some Virgo planet that's criticizing, or whatever it might be. But it's like that thing, and we find it, and then we get in there. And again, you could do that at various levels of astrological fluency. People don't have to know a lot to kind of get in there. You might not even call it Virgo, Mars in Virgo, or whatever. You might just call it the person who's nagging you, like the part that's nagging, and you go over there. In therapeutic modes of astrology, uh, the naming of the astrology is always possibly not using astrology language. It's always possible to use other language, probably preferable often. But you, the person watching, kind of still know what you're watching, and you're offering things at different points. So
mm,
I think role reversal into planets is a really powerful way to remind yourself of the complexity of your partner, to remind yourself of how much they're dealing with internally, right? We've all got sort of situations of fate that are, engaging us, and you're kind of getting inside that with someone, which is in some ways what people seem to need the most. That's the beauty of this too in groups, is that um, the profundity of having what you're going through witnessed and even co-experienced, right? And again, that's the gift of the astrologer, even in a one-on-one consultation where you're working with things like this, is that there's a deeper felt sense of resonance that takes, like, you really get me. And that feeling of getting gotten, which is like massively missing in most people's lives and on an ongoing basis. Like the capacity to feel, oops, excuse me, the capacity to feel attuned to, and the experience of attunement. So I often feel like as astrologers, we give that from a human to human, but we're also helping people feel attuned to by the sky, by the living, by the world that we're embedded in. It's very
right.
embedding. It's very embedding.
That makes sense. Um, all right. So let's see. I wanted to, since we have about an hour left, because I know we have time limits today, I want to make sure we hit any other major points that you want to talk about. To circle around back to where we started, I just wanted to clarify, is Barbara Schermer's book,
Mm,
Astrology Alive, would you say that's one
yeah.
of the like foundational texts for experiential astrology?
I think it's almost the only text that I really know of that takes that on as this is what this is. And it gives, like, she's got a million suggestions for ways people can do this. There's suggestion after suggestion of, meaning take a walk as each planet, walk as Mars here. And she gives you lots of music suggestion, like a playlist for, so to speak. We would call, I don't think she would have called it playlist, the playlist for, different planets. And people already do these things, but there's a lot in there. Yeah, I would say that's kind of the one that I know about, as far as a text. Yeah.
Okay. And she was an astrologer. I know she was really big in organizing conferences and big in astrological organizations in the 1980s and 90s. I think she was involved in helping to organize the first UAC in 1986,
Mm,
from what I saw from that documentary. But she passed away from cancer relatively young, I think in the 2000s or
yeah.
so. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Yeah.
Okay. And then you had mentioned other names as well of just people that have done work on this, like Jeff Jar and Rick
Hmm.
Levine,
Hmm.
Melanie Reinhart.
Hmm.
You had also mentioned Patricia Walsh,
Hmm.
and and you finally also mentioned Michael Luton. And Michael Luton was interesting because he famously organized these big plays
Yeah.
at UAC, which were often astrologically themed, sometimes about like what was going on in terms of like the current transits and stuff like that. Like I want to say the 2008 UAC play that I attended, I think had to do with like Pluto and Capricorn, which was like just going into Capricorn at that time.
Mm.
Um, so that's a whole other side of experiential astrology to a certain extent, is like plays and drama and different things that may
Hmm.
not be the astrodrama thing that we're talking about in terms of living out a person's chart, but may be incorporating astrology into art and into theater or into other things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, performance, like, and music, being inspired in that way. Again, storytelling and writing writing is really powerful for that. People also do things like, integrate like body movement practices, like, like Tai Chi. And I've, Stephen Sprung, who's someone I know here, has a long relationship with Tai Chi, and now also does, movements that are sort of inspired by the signs of the zodiac, right? And that's a way to sort of feel into it in a different way. So there's, yeah, exactly that these creative modalities, being paired with astrological ways of seeing and knowing, it evolves that modality as well as the astrology both. Like you've got different ways of access just a juicier, sort of experience of astrology that really, begins to be just a way that you're moving around. That you're sort of, as many of us, we're always seeing the signatures of planets. We're always, but in this type of astrology, you take a minute and amplify that, and you work very consciously with the subjective experience of the astrology. You sort of say that's a crucial ingredient rather than saying that's an ingredient we need to get out of the way so we can get to the objective thing. We're actually saying no, actually the subjectivity is actually where the material will most disclose meaning, is in your lived experience, what your body is feeling, what your emotions, your sensations, not just your thinking.
Right. So it's almost like you're trying to create a field where you can almost like force or elicit a subjective experience of the symbols and of the planetary meanings.
Yeah, you said that beautifully. Yeah, exactly. Creating a field would be the language I most prefer, is that you're really, and in a way, what you're really doing is just supporting already existing field, but you're setting in place some things. It's a little bit like, one way to think about it is with ritual or ceremony, which also would be modes of this, right? And, it kind of goes back to a very long history with theurgy and magic and those pieces. This is very much related to that. But there's this whole thing that you create, for the purposes of whatever you're doing, you bound it off from the ordinary world, right? You draw the circle for a particular ceremony, right? Or you set the lines on the court for a particular sport. For something where we're going to enter that thing, and it's a special space where things happen. And so a sandbox, like you put it this way. I mean, one of the good stories of experiential astrology here in Santa Fe, Tom Brady seemed like everybody's astrologer. Like when I first started doing astrology, I would constantly be, people are like, are you going to be as good as Tom? They're like, Tom really understood me. I don't know about you. And what he did most of his readings with sand tray figures. So he would have a sand tray and these different, figurines, and he would place them in the tray and sort of set them up and show the person, here's what's going on. Or he would bring the transit in with another one, right? And you can do that in a really, you can do it. You can decide who's who. I think he had some specific images that he always used for particular planets, but you don't have to do that. Um, and it sort of stays with people. But the beginning of it is to sort of draw the thing, and even the chart itself, the horoscope itself, sort of has this circle, like, okay, we're in a special space where we're saying these symbols mean this. Or the same way when you go onto a volleyball court, you're playing with your friends, but while you're in there, you're going to be enemies. You're going to be opponents, and the game only works if you really both commit to the game. So it's very similar with all these methods. You're creating a field by sort of just setting it apart. And then you're saying everything that happens in here is this thing. Like in other words, everything that happens in here is the volleyball thing. Or in astrology, right? Or in experiential astrology, we say, or I say, that once we've set the field, everything should be interpreted as symbolic revelation. So every occurrence that occurs, like no matter what, even if it's something that seems like it's not part of anything, everything can be read through the symbolic language. One of the things that another form of experiential astrology, right, is going to sacred sites associated with astrology. And Gray Crawford and I just took a group to Greece, in September. And one of the things that I kept saying to the participants after a few days, when suddenly everybody's saying, "Oh, there's the god," and someone loses their luggage and they immediately put it to Hermes, and the luggage ends up back to the hotel before we even do. It's the day that Mercury stationed. It's that kind of moment, um, and we began to interpret everything. And then we had the bus driver, or the local tour guide Maria, who was with us. At the end of the trip, she said, I've never been with a group like this before. Like, nobody ever got mad at me. Every time something went wrong, they just said, "It's the gods." In other words, you are in a seemingly hallucinatory. We would have sounded kind of insane to anybody but the people on the bus. It would be like, "What are you talking about?" Like you're attributing all this. It would seem like attribution. But for the purposes of that ceremony of being on that tour for 14 days and moving around and telling stories, the information is revealed, symbols disclose themselves. You're in your own, you're in your own reverie with it. And so this is very similar. Like, so the setting apart and the sort of having agreed roles. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's what the roles are. Having clear containing processes, having ways to amplify and bring, raise up and bring down. All of that is tending that field that you named. Like it's like and the better your capacity to tend to the field, and the beautiful. Oh, this is important too. The power of astrology in this is really interesting because I find, and as a therapist, I felt this, and as a group work is really everything I do now. And so, as a group dynamicist, the beautiful thing is that astrology, in and of itself, coheres a field rapidly, right? Like, it is a coherent field. We've been doing this for thousands of years. Like, the field is very coherent already. So if you that the like astrodrama can actually do more powerful things than just normal old psychodrama or whatever, because it's got the field's it's been held for a long time. These stories have been told for a long time. So there's a really deep thing, that you're bringing in that kind of holds the work. So it's not just that you, the facilitator, are holding the work. You're held by this incredible field of story and myth and tradition, that is very reliable, and you can really count on it. You can really trust it to operate. You just have to kind of help people get out of the way and let it speak, which to me is a reading, a consultation is the same. Like, you're just really creating the space and the languages for the symbol to speak, to disclose itself. It's just harder than it sounds.
Right. It reminds me of there's this really elaborate, almost like ceremonial form of Hori astrology in India called Ashtamangala Prajna.
Mm,
And the whole process of like reading the Hori chart, there's like this build up to it. And that day, I think that day or maybe that week, the astrologer will pay attention to any like signs or omens that happen in their vicinity, even on the
mm.
way to where
Yeah.
they'll read the Hori chart publicly. Like if like a group of school children like crosses in front of their path, like that will
Hmm.
be a symbol or like a sign of something. And just paying attention to what's happening in your environment as being part of the universe itself as like a living entity, like speaking to you about what's happening in that moment through symbolism in some way. And it just reminds me a little bit of that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly it. It's like you're letting you're making yourself available to hear the symbolic universe communicating in so many different languages, not just through the mental. You're giving yourself permission. I just was sitting with somebody for a consultation yesterday, and one of the really amazing things that happened, we were in the beginning, and um, kind of just starting to share and talk a little bit. And eventually, I noticed behind her, there's this painting that was sort of like a flame kind of going across the canvas a little bit. And, but I had this immediate association, somehow the shape of the flame, it just reminded me of the John Singer Sargent painting of Chiron and Achilles. Like somehow it looked like the front of a horse and the torso of the man coming up. Looked just like that shape. And I actually pulled that image up, to see. I don't, the funny thing about it is it's not like it objectively resembles that, but it did to me and it did to this person in the moment. And that actually took us to this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction that she has in Sag, for early 70s, and then the Chiron and Aries, and that led us to the focus on this. There was a grand trine between those, and then I think the Leo ascendant, and so it led to that place, and that became the most significant revelatory part of the reading from my perspective was when we got there. But I didn't go in planning like I'm going to talk about that. I've got a whole bunch of things that are all available to be gone to, but in the moment that's how the symbol came, right? Was through my subjective association with that painting, like, which would seem to be like whatever, but yet in that moment, and I'm not even sure I would normally have seen that image in there, but somehow that's what presented. And I think this is always happening. Like for me, the best experiential work sources first from the encounter with the field spontaneously, meaning we don't just jump right into now we're going to do this chart or now, but much more we see what is arising already. You're sort of listening experientially, you're sort of listening and feeling for who's trying to appear here. Because that's usually the one you need, is the one who comes in a way that isn't already symbolized, isn't already on the piece of paper. Often that is the creature in the ecosystem. I always think about the chart as an ecosystem, of animals, and, like zodiac means circle of animals. It's like these creatures are all there, and we never know. I don't feel I know before a reading which ones really need to do this talking here, which ones have the information that will be most meaningful. There are millions techniques you could do to try to decide that, but I'm led by the moment, and I think experiential process has to be led by the moment. But with reference, you're always going to be going back to the technical. You're always going to be looking, so in other words, you're on the earth and you're looking at the sky, and then you're on the earth and you're looking at the sky. That's kind of how I see it. You're in this weaving, because in that example I gave, the image, comes and then takes us into the trine. It takes us into that experience, and then we open that up a little bit symbolically, and name that some, and then we're back to something from life experience, and then so there's a weaving going on, right, between the technique, between the the astrology official material, and the lived experience, and you're kind of doing this constant reweaving. And when I say on Earth, I always feel with astrology, when I first came into astrology, all the modern astrologers used to say, Uranus is the ruler. Some people still would say that Uranus is the ruler of astrology. And, Uranus was half of an archetypal pair, right? Uranus is the sky and Gaia was the earth. And then there's a whole story about what Uranus did, right? Uranus sort of declared himself independent. He was born from the earth, but kind of declared himself independent of the earth, and then raped the earth, and then stopped letting the earth's children incarnate, right? They couldn't come up above the surface. He would sort of push them back in and not allow it. And I've always seen this as it's the beginning of the Greek cosmology, essentially. There's a little bit of a primordial situation with Eros and Nyx and others, but this is really the first sort of characterizations. And I've always felt that that's the Greeks showing us what their main dilemma was, which was that the languaging mind and its concepts and its ideas, which did in fact arise from being sensate creatures, earthly creatures, declared itself separate, like kind of disembeds itself, and then dominates things. And so in a similar way, this can happen with astrology, where it could just detach and be in this sort of mental world of abstraction and concepts, and forget that to weave the relationship, that we're in relationship with Earth, and Earth meaning our bodies, our the earth literally, but also our senses. Because you can also do this, by the way, with nature. You can go out into the, and see the archetypes in that way. But the point being that there's this weaving that's going on. So when you're doing experiential work, there might be times where there's no astrology language being used. You're just fully in some sort of process, and emotion or image making, whatever it might be. But always we're going to be returning to the sky and getting the context and then weaving back and forth, right? And they each can deepen each other. The lived experience can deepen your sense of the astrology, and the astrology can take you more into the lived experience. Because this is the antidote to the way that sometimes astrology takes people out of their experience. As soon as something happens in life, they name the astrology of it, and it actually kind of shuts it down. Like, oh, this is just that. Like, and it doesn't open up to more learning and understanding. It actually can go, close things. But if we're doing this kind of ongoing back and forth conversation, I think that's what we're facilitating, in this.
One of the things I keep thinking and hearing you talk about this more, and going back to something you said earlier, but just how this incorporates movement, and that like movement is actually a really core concept underlying most astrology, is some form of
Oh,
movement,
wow.
that it's not just time but also movement. And that maybe one of the downsides of contemporary astrology, of how astrology developed over the past 2000 years, once we started using ephemerises to calculate planets and to calculate like a static birth chart, is that the birth chart itself just looks like it's a two-dimensional thing that doesn't move. But in reality, what you're looking at is like a snapshot in time of how the planets were moving, both in terms of the diurnal rotation and the daily rising and culminating and setting of the planets, as well as the motion of the planets through the signs of the zodiac along the ecliptic. And
Mhm.
that this really reconnects with a core thing that would have been much more evident in ancient astrology, where they're
Mm.
going out and actually like witnessing the planets and seeing them move every day and every night, is just that
Mhm.
core concept of motion.
Yeah, yeah, I love that you're naming that. I have just the way you said that, and it again also reminds me of the sort of mercurial archetype, which I think has so much to do with movement, and with loosening. There's a loosening in this work where, yeah, you are unstiffening things, and you are reminding the dynamism that's going on in the sky, right? The diamond and the dynamism that's going on in life on Earth that the sky reflects. So I think you're right. There's that movement piece, and again, in this work, there's literally moving around, and movement can be really, really slow, as we know, from the sky. But it's like, that's actually one of the things I always say about Mercury and myth. You know, uh, Unlike most of the other gods, right? Mercury doesn't really come with agenda like a consistent kind of injunction, right? Like Venus consistently draws you into your passions, right? Mars consistently wants you to fight. Athena wants you to be strategic, etc. But Mercury just shows up and seems when Mercury shows up on the scene in mythology, and I find in astrology, the commitment of Mercury is just to movement, right? It's just to like the next thing happening. Let the story play. He shows up a lot in myth when things are cycling and sort of stuck. That's often when Mercury just appears and kind of gets things moving again. And I often think that's what astrology is able to do. It's like, again, we don't have to come with a particular injunction to the client, like do this, do that. We are often just helping the system kind of lubricate a little and move and be seen, felt, experienced. It's a very different energy, and it can be quite subtle. I think that's a really important piece too, that this work is not always dramatic and over the top. And of course, that's great. And it's often a lot of fun. There's a playful quality. But really, this can be as subtle as just when you're in a session with somebody and they you know, they say something in a certain tone, and you can hear a planet speaking, and you can just say to them, you know, could you just say more in that same tone of voice? I just am curious to hear more from that. And you might hear it and you might start to feel it. And what would someone who speaks in that tone say about your situation with your lawyer? And they might do, and then you would then be able to say, well, that I think you're speaking from Mars in Sagittarius, and this, and you know, you are really the truth teller in this moment, and that is what is about to be, you know, transited, or whatever the thing might be. It's like these are many moments, right, of experience. So we don't have to create this big ceremony called experiential and make it a big production. Like that is, of course, at its full, you know, glory, I guess. But I hope for people to become more experiential in regular astrological practice of all kinds. Like I'm encouraging people to slow down with the information transmission of astrology. Like, you know, here's this, here's that, here's this. Slow down and actually drop into the experience a little more, and let it lead. Like, don't let your delineation lead. You know, let the material lead, or at least for 5 minutes. You know, like, you know, take a pause and really, you know, see what happens when you just, again, what have I done there when I say to that person? What I've done is I've created a little mini field to your language, like, and I've said, you know, hey, Mars, you want to talk some more for a minute? You know, like and again, it doesn't have, they don't have to know any astrology because they're already doing it. I sensed that Mars was in the room, and I'm just sort of giving them a little more time to bring some more Mars. Um, and then I can name the astrology, and then we're kind of in and out of it. But they're going to walk away remembering talking that way, right? That it, again, it has a bodily signature that develops. And so then when the transit comes that we've talked about, or the something has shifted, that is available somatically as a register that they can be working with, tracking, following, um, in you know, whatever ways they do. So the mini moments, I think, are, in the end, they are probably the most crucial. And again, they're quite subtle. Like it's a, and it will probably redirect your reading when that happens. Like if it because it's another, it's polyvocal, right? You've begun, oh, and that's the thing, right? You've begun to, rather than just talk about the astrology, you're talking to it, right? Rather than talking about Mars, you're listening and talking as Mars or to Mars. So you're in a living relationship. And that's where it goes back to like the notion of earlier ways of experiencing reality, and not just earlier. I think people still can experience reality this way, but where we understand ourselves to be in a constant conversation with all of life. And and so in this moment, we're doing that instead of kind of pulling away to the Archimedean point and imagining that we have some sort of claim to being outside the system and able to make observations about it. It's saying actually being inside the system is the perfect way to make meaning together. It lets you bring all of you to the experience, like, and it gives the symbol exactly the right place to speak from. You know, it's also how you end up with radically creative ways of seeing different planets in different situations. Like, when you have like, you know, you have people from different backgrounds. You have women versus men, or not versus like against, but like, as you know, you're getting perspectives from different people's bodies, life histories, memories, identities that are going to have totally different refractions, like a prism. They're going to reflect the archetype in totally different ways based on their own early experiences or whatever. Like, we're all positioned somewhere, but that's the beauty. It means we each can bring the archetype in our, from our own, what we've got available to talk from, you know, our own experiences, our own memories. Memories are really powerful. Like a lot of times you share a memory in a reading. I like, you know, when you see Venus somewhere and you're like, oh, I remember seeing this somewhere else. And I know I might share that. I remember this person who had this place, you know, and that's very subjective. Why that one now? You know, that, but it's a way in, like all these valuing these moments that are the result of you being local, you know. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the greatest things also is, and aside from bringing in the subjective component and reconnecting astrologers with that rather than it just being an objective numbers-based discipline, there's also so this element of like fun and playfulness, which I think
mm,
is probably one of the greatest things that the Pluto and Leo generation this being like a product of that generation, that I can see that this tries to like re-import into
Mhm.
astrology, is this sense of like fun and playfulness, which might also have a side effect of making astrology more accessible to people, where that element, having some element of that, might speak to them more from an educational or understanding standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, the shortest distance between two brains is laughter. I mean, two people laughing
Mm.
together move into resonance just like that. And then you can say something. I mean, I am a person who likes to lecture in a kind of performative style. And part of it is that I want to be loosened up together and in a playful mode together. And then you can deliver stuff. Something can come, which is fairly plump, but you've got a field of play and resonance, and we're just having a good time. Exactly, which is in and of itself just nice, but it also thinking pedagogically or thinking in terms of receptivity to information or receptivity to divination, uh, a relaxed state where you're not where you don't have your, what is this, the brow furrowed, you're not like figuring it out. You're kind of just relaxing and playing around. That is often the way, the flow states they would talk about, right? Like where it just kind of naturally will come. And yeah, so it does, it limbers people up. Not everybody, kind of like what you said earlier, like experiential work can sometimes make people feel on the spot and they become more, they feel more closed down and more stuck. So that's again where we really have to read the room. A very useful concept in this is the notion of warm up. That we really need to understand everybody's got a different warm up, and probably every planet in your horoscope has a different warm up, right? Like my Uranus Mercury conjunction is always ready to, like, let's do it, get in there. Um, no matter what, like but my Mars retrograde in Taurus is considerably slower to do much of anything. So we've all got multiple warm up process, and then in a group you've got that many things times the number of members in the group. So you're trying to sort of feel what is already warmed up and then to gently warm things up. So it really, there's just ways to meet people, where they are, and to, as you said, to make it fun, to have a good time. People love doing like some warm-ups are things like, you have people in a room, okay, all the fire mercury's in one corner, all the water's in one corner, and then you just spontaneously say, I want everybody to do a skit of what it's like to be this placement, like each group has to do a skit within 2 minutes. You don't give them time to get to and people come out and sometimes they do things that are whatever. But it's very fun. First of all, it's super fun, and people immediately creates resonances in the group. You're developing relations in the group right from the beginning. Um, and everybody kind of puts themselves into it a little bit. And there people can find ways to do it, right? You could go off in the corner and say that, there are a million things you can do. So those are often really good warm-ups just to kind of get the play body playful, right? And occasionally those can be profound. I mean, it all depends. But they're almost always, and they're pretty memorable actually. So usually when I do retreats, like week-long retreats or stuff like their workshops, I'll start with some of things like that just help us kind of limber up and connect in different ways. And then you've established that this is playtime. Like, it's and play has very play to me means something more than just haha. Like it's play is kind of what we do as astrologers, meaning we go into this sort of sandbox of the chart and we make figures and we played in there many times and we do different things. It's a special set apart world where we can experience and see things that we don't always experience and see. And the beauty of this too is that I mean psychodrama was formed by watching children play. That was actually how Moreno developed his methods. He saw children play, and one of the major observations was some children were very good at play in the sense that they could move from role to role to role to role, like in different scenarios. The other children, like, always had to be the villain or always had to be the winner. they were what he called role locked. And the point of psychodrama was actually to develop role flexibility, spontaneity, the ability to have the most adequate response to each moment, which I think is an interesting statement for astrology, like the most adequate response to each moment, like and by adequate is the word that could be unpacked, but the notion that you have all your possibilities available for how to respond. Like the more you've been inside, in and out of these different roles, and really cultivated relationships with these different parts of self or parts of the universe or both. I think they're always both. The more you've developed those relationships, the more you have to call on when life brings whatever it brings, right? You start to become co-conscious, like in psychological terms. If you were thinking about parts of people, usually what would be most helpful for most people psychologically is to have all the different parts of themselves be able to connect and talk to each other. That is usually that's a useful thing no matter what specific treatment you're trying to attain. Getting things talking, which usually maybe do not, and pointing here because the neurobiology part is talked about in this way, kind of literal physical way. But it's a similar thing with these types of processes, get things connecting that don't always connect. And therefore, in any given situation, the possibility is there of accessing the place that would have the most helpful response, or that would be most, beneficial, meaningful, whatever languages we use for good things. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the value of play, I mean, I think that's a great uh thing here in terms of our full moon and Leo sort
Yeah.
of episode that we're doing here, the value of fun and play, the
Mm,
way to make things more accessible. Um, what are some of the, like, in terms of ensuring the quality of the discipline or the method, or
mm,
some of the limits or challenges that you might encounter? I know we've touched upon this a little bit, but I can imagine sometimes, like I remember I went to what was it? It was a little like conference once, and it was a smaller, it was like an OPA conference, and like at the end we were all supposed to like delineate somebody's chart publicly, and
mm,
we did, but the person got up afterwards and like didn't really say anything and didn't really confirm or anything, and then the event just ended, and we were all a
mm,
little bit bewildered. But it turned out later that several of us had like touched on something that was really sensitive in the person's chart that they just didn't really go into publicly, and so we realized the kind of shortcomings of that format, or at least potential
mhm,
um, issues with trying to do things as just like a demonstration of an astrologer's proficiency or something like that. That there's other things that can come into play. What are some of the limitations or the challenges or other things? I
mm,
imagine with this, one of the limitations would be, especially if you were acting out the chart, if you had multiple people, the individual people acting it out may have different levels of proficiency or understanding, or even like
mhm.
um, in terms of like bedside manner, the some people may be better or potentially not as good at saying certain things that might be appropriate or inappropriate about a person's like placements or charts.
Mhm. Yeah, well, yes, and I think that actually is interesting the way you said that, because I think one of the hardest things to do is to get people to stay in role, especially if they know a lot of astrology. They often want to begin to make observations on the chart, but if we're
Mm,
in this process, that's not what we're doing, right? You're going into one area and being that thing. Like you're not really meta reflecting, at least not at this point. But the thing that comes to mind that I think is a useful way to think about all these modes of experiential work that we've been naming is they used to make a little curve, I think it's called the Hollander curve. I can't quite remember, but it basically has three parts. It's got a warm up, an action, and an integration. Those are sort of the three stages of experiential processes. Like there's a warming up and so one of the biggest mistakes people make is to not really tend to the warm up and really kind of, help the group to. Now, sometimes people warm up very fast, right? Sometimes we're going to do this conference, and by day 3, the workshop, when people come into workshops, they're already going to be warmed up because they've been in workshops for 2 days at that point. Like, so the warm up is, you don't have to think as much about it because it's probably going to, people are hot, they're already in it in some ways. So, but often that's not the case. So you really have to see about warm up, and like with that person, how warmed up are they really to receive information in a public setting? It's a fairly fishbowl situation. So, there's that part of the warm up. Also, really important for people is that you yourself as the practitioner need to check your warm up. What are you actually ready for? What are you not ready for? It's okay to not want to go certain places. It's okay to not open up certain things. It's a limitation. It is a limitation, but you get to have limitations. We don't have to go everywhere that you could go. So there's the warm up part, then the action is, whatever we do. And then this other third part is the integration. And it occurs to me, like with what you were describing, like the event ended and it ended, but like there's an integration that we would work in with this kind of work, like meaning, so after all the action has happened, whatever we've done, people have made art or talked about it, or somebody shared a dream and we've enacted the dream, whatever the different methods and modes are. Once the action part is over, there's a definite part of time where it's really about sharing. It's really about integrating it, bringing it into language. Often that's when a lot of the astrology reflections can then happen, right? Then we do take that larger view and we talk about the chart as a dynamic system. We make observations. We talk about what have we learned for ourselves. Anybody in a role shares what it was like to be in the role, how the role, what they learned for themselves in the role. Because usually a role comes to just the right person. Like it's just the moment when someone needs to practice their Saturn, like needs to do it. Or, they will be experiencing the frustrations that they experience in something else, and this will give them an answer. We always say in these group processes, when one person's working, we're all working. Like everybody's getting stuff out of it at a personal level and at an educational level. So then with the integration time is a time to do all of those things. And again, one way to think about this work also is that it's I do a lot with sort of psychological imaginings of sect and what I have often talked about as night consciousness, day consciousness, and sort of building from Rob Hand's notion that the Pythagorean table has some connection to the distinction of night and day, of the opposites. And so, you could say that a lot of astrology, with its emphasis on technique and functionality, and it has a day orientation, like that you're illuminating, you're making things clear, you are, thinking about it's rational. There's a rationality in it, and that a lot of what we're consulting in experiential work is the irrational, or it might be better to say the non-rational, or even the trans-rational. We're visiting a wilder kind of place that does not work linearly, right? That doesn't work that way. It works in lunar, Martian, Venusian ways, which are, as a rule, I would offer not very linear, and can actually very much take things away. You get gripped by your passions, or you get gripped by, love, or whatever the thing is, or your needs. So we're visiting that place and we're giving a lot of space to it. And it's always dangerous to do that. Like dangerous meaning to the structures of life that we've set up, or the way we know ourselves, or the way we know astrology. It's like, so when we've been in that action part of the curve, we've been in night in a sense, right? We've gone into something a little more all over, and now we're returning, and we need that transitional return, and not like we're always in day, and it's not that simple. But the basic idea being that it's important to kind of return to normal life, come out of role, have a chance to really integrate it, to use language, to restore regular being in the world. And integration is very overlooked in Western culture entirely, really. Like the need to not just go to the next thing, but to actually integrate the thing you've been in. That's one of the big errors I see when people do experiential work with groups, is they don't build in the integration. They let the action go till like minute 59 out of an hour. And then they're left with all this activation in the room. And as you were just observing, like with, and I'm not sure that an integration period would have helped that person or not, but like that experience where everybody's kind of left in whoa, and and so I really am a person who favors, again, smaller action components. They're vital and alive, but they're smaller, and a lot of time on either side to, really integrate it. It's a twilight mode, to again come to Mercury, our god of twilight, who was both night and day. Mercury is about weaving, to my mind, it's about weaving the worlds, weaving the day and the night, and not just all night, all in, all activation, all, I made a reference to this secured symbolizing field. It's a notion of a person named William Goodhart, who, Jungian guy, just a stray article, but I've always found it very helpful. He talks about he's speaking for Jungian psychotherapy with dreams. By the way, we didn't really speak, but dreams are a massive way into experiential work, dream work. One of my favorite questions that I almost always ask now at consultations is whether people have had a dream in the last few days. Because again, the dream gives you a rich source of their inner experience, their own images, their own, that then you'll see the chart immediately, you'll see it reflected, and then that'll, create that. But in this notion from Goodhart with the secured symbolizing field, that he has this notion of three different fields that can kind of predominate in encounters of this kind where we're working with symbolism. One is the so-called persona restoring field, which is where it's kind of flat and arid and dry, like it's just information, and there's not, like, the person's kind of flat often, they don't give you much, they're kind of not necessarily shut down, but doesn't seem like anything's allowed to go anywhere. And we've all sat with that in astrology, in consultation. Sounds like even that person you mentioned was a little bit in that mode, where it's really like, are you feeling anything? Is any, that kind of thing. And then there is the complex discharging field. That's the second field. And that field is when there's like a possession by the material, like there's just like too much, it's muchness of whatever it is, like lots of feelings or lots of, overwhelm or whatever the thing be, triggered, flooded, those types of words. And that the secured symbolizing field is where you're somewhere in the in-between. And this is that Mercury twilight, like Mercury twinkling at the end, right after the sun's down or before it's up, like a little moment where you have access to the complexes, to the both fields. Like you have the access to like the place that keeps things functioning, keeps the ships running, keeps has the vision for where it needs to go. To me, these are Jupiter, Saturn, Sun type of things. Has all of that going on, and also has access to all this erotic, juicy, a lot. And by erotic, I mean sexual, but not just sexual. Like life force, has access to all of that, and is weaving them together. And that's. I want the director to stay in twilight modes of consciousness, to always be attending to the day realities of people, of functionality, also the realities of our astrological technique and orientation. You asked about how to keep it, or how to ensure the quality. One of the biggest things is I think it's really important to be very grounded and deep in whatever mode of astrological practice is yours. Like that technical proficiency, and really, really like feeling like again, we're back to that land metaphor. This place, you've been around, not like not in an omniscient way, but you are familiar. It's really familiarity, but that's built, as you said, over time and experience. It's not merely you've learned all the official things. So that saturation in that field is very important. And then the other side of it, it's also very important for people to have a fairly developed notion of whatever their method is. Like, so that's your astrological technique, then there's your experiential method. What is that, and how does that work? And we want to see people who can really bring both of those together. And both of them take some time. It doesn't mean people shouldn't have a good time and just go ahead and do some role play. I think they should. I mean, I think you should go for it. Like in a reading, particularly in a one-on-one thing where it's, the stakes are lower. The people aren't watching and getting upset. You're just in a little moment of free for all. But the trick is you also have to be at the other end of it. You really need to do some experiential astrology. And it's a little bit like how they say, you shouldn't be a therapist and never have gone to therapy, only
Mm,
studied the techniques. You need to be a patient. So if you're going to do this with querents or clients, then you need to also you need to do it, in the encounter. Um, and therefore you'll develop that habit of vulnerability and openness to to whatever might come. But I've kind of gone all over. Sorry, that's it.
no, that was good.
Yeah.
What are some of the like things you've learned or like challenges that have arose that were like learning lessons for you or even like failures
Hmm.
that you've grown from in the process of doing this?
I would say for sure the error that I made the most when I was earlier in doing this was that like the part about warm up and the importance of really making sure everybody's warming up. We're not all going to warm up exactly the same, but
Mm,
meaning it would be too fast to something fairly, significant, or too fast to a large, you can probably hear that I've been sounding this cautionary note a bit as we're talking, because a lot of times the people attracted to do this type of work with others have a sort of intensity. We have a sort of like, let's get in there, like I want to do it now. There's a passion for it, which is beautiful, but it's so important to really be in an attuned relationship with what is the field ready for? What do you have the resources to actually explore? The resources in yourself. What does that person have the resources for? So I think that's one of it's probably the biggest thing. I mean, I kind of spoke to it when we're speaking about warm up and integration, because to me, those are
right.
those two parts, which I always think, I did that little curve. I don't have a drawing of it, but hopefully people can see me. I just, it's not that special of a motion, but what I like about it is I always think of it in astrology of like the metaphor I often use when teaching that to practitioners is like, it's kind of like our, synodic cycles, or particularly the lunar cycle, or the lunation cycle of, it's like you have a new moon and then you're waxing, waxing, waxing to fullness, and that would be the action zone perhaps. And then you're waning, back to the new moon. And that could be seen the warm up, action, integration. And we know very well that I know very well that that the culture doesn't like to wane. It likes to wax, it will increase, go further, go faster. So we've got to really attend to that waning part of the cycle, right? Like and it's again, um, it can be hard to you know first of all, it can be hard to lift people's foot off the brake and actually let the thing move a little, let the experiential process move. But then it can also be challenging to put the brake on, right? So you really ideally in this work it helps to do it a little bit together for a while, like that's why I like doing like these online groups for 10 or 12 weeks, or you begin to let the group begins to have that habit of how to engage. So this is powerful because the thing about this work is you're teaching many things, including one of the most important for me is in living an astrological life is the ability to pendulate and to move in and out of archetypal realities, in and out of relationships with different gods, um, which is, I think, a life skill, of how to do that. How do I step in and out of that? And it's a discipline, right? There's something one is learning, and you're also developing relationships over time with all these different planets and different signs and houses, uh, where you are, you're reweaving your experience ongoingly. So it's a kind of ongoing practice, and it can be done in the smallest little moments. I think that's really the other thing is people think it has to get big in order to be real. It has to be, it has to be a Michael Luton production, or a Cecil B. DeMille, psychodrama, as they used to say. Like, and those are amazing, of course, but actually, most of this is going to happen, like most of life, at a relatively, somewhere in between, and yet those will be, very alive. So it doesn't have to be. I think that's one of the things that that's maybe part of why I'm trying to emphasize too, that it's not just the astrodrama and the movement, which often has a, but it is this work with art and image and dream, you know, and writing and sensation and just movement. It doesn't have to be playing a planet. All of those are there. The other thing, to answer your question about limitations or, you know, difficulties, is that I do think it's always the case, right, when we are working with others with astrology, that our stuff is going to affect what we do. In fact, that's actually impossible not to happen. But of course, there are thresholds here, and you know, your own material to dominate the you know, like somebody has a belief that something about what I've want to talk about in the reading is wrong, and then they don't realize that they're telling me no. They use astrological justification, but actually it's just their stuff about that topic. So that happens all the time in readings. And so in this mode of work, the astrologer's own material can easily, you know, become more potent because you yourself are in the experience. You're again, you're in Mercury mode. You know, you are in and out. You're in nighttime immersion and you're also in daytime observation. Like, and so you can get pulled in all the way, right? You'll find yourself drawn in. The question is, can you use that in the moment? Like, so this happens to me in readings, right? Where I have an available emotional body. So I'll use that Saturn moon example again. Like, you know, someone has Saturn square the moon, and I find myself starting to feel judgmental of them. You know, it just, and I'm like, "Boy, this person is really, you know, needy and like, I don't, you know, get over it." And that's not my, I was gonna say it's not my normal thing, but I have Saturn rising. It might be my normal thing. But you know, there's that energy that's starting to constellate. So if I'm not careful, if I don't know that about that, I might just start to give off that vibe of like, you know, you're kind of annoying, you know, that might just start to happen. But if I notice that I'm being drawn that way, like if I feel the pull to judge, I will probably be able to see it in the sky, and I will consider that that's the one we need to talk about because it came in through my body, like it came in the relational field, like that I got constellated into the aspect. Because I think one important way to see our charts is that they're always, to me, they're always intrapsychic and they're always interpersonal. And so, you know, if you're in your moon, you're going to attract Saturns. Like that's just probably what's going to happen. And but if I can notice that I'm being drawn into a role, and again, my experience with this stuff is part of what lets me notice that. I'm so used to noticing those states, and I'm like, oh wow, I'm getting really Saturn here, you know. And then I can pull out, and I have options about how to do it. Then I can name it. I would probably I rarely would name that I feel judgmental in a one-time session. I might do that if I know the person a little more, but I can certainly name the aspect, or I could say, you know, do you find people often judge you? You know, like you'll find your way in, but you begin to be able to talk about that Saturn moon. So there's an availability to the field, you know, that's going on that this work trains us to do. We just naturally are tracking our own responses. But the problem in this work and the limitation back to that is that if you're not tracking yourself, if you don't have that habit of self-reflexively asking what makes me want to do the thing I'm about to do as the director, if you don't have that question regularly in your mind, like what's leading me here, then you will probably start acting out and you'll be a character in the drama and not know it. So, and I've done it, and I think everybody's done it, but it's an ongoing habit of reflexive, you know, asking, what am I inside of? Which is to me, that is the question of astrology. It's the question that astrology exists for. What am I inside of? What cycle, what myth, what story? So it's not a new question for us. It's the question we're always answering. Like, what am I inside of? What story am I in? What template? What agenda, planetary agenda, or cycle? But it's a question that we have to ask a lot as experiential astrologers because we'll get drawn in. It's natural.
Yeah, I saw some discussion forum recently where somebody had a consultation that they didn't think went well because they felt like the astrologer's subjective
Mm,
experience or opinions that they were inserting those into the consultation, and the person thought that astrology should be more objective or something, and it was
mm,
making me reflect on that there is a subjective component to astrology, and that you can't actually remove that,
Mm-mm.
no matter how objective an astrologer is trying to be. Some of their personal experiences and background and likes and dislikes and all sorts of other things are going to go into the reading in some form or another. But it sounds like one of the things that you're aiming for here with experiential astrology is to find a balance between those subjective and objective realms, sort of like the day and night distinction that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that really what it's saying is that the subjective will always be present. Therefore, consider it an active area to consciously make use of. In psychotherapy, we talk about the use of oneself, the therapist, the use of self in the process, like that your reactions, your thoughts, and so on, they're going to be there regardless, but can they be actually informative about the encounter? Can they assist you? And it's very much, I mean, again, I don't know that we'll have time to go there, but I think I had mentioned to you when I think about work like Jeffrey Cornelius' work, or the work that some have done with hermeneutics and astrology, and this whole question of how does the symbol reveal itself, and how does the subjective, it is actually, in some ways of seeing, it's the subjective that actually makes that crucial turn towards the possibility of revelation, like the what you bring, if you bring it. And I guess I should just say I would distinguish this from what that person experienced where the astrologer just spouting opinions. That's not what I mean. I mean just the what you're experiencing is useful and meaningful, rather than you need to detach from yourself and just do astrology, quote in quotes, do astrology, like, delineate. Because even your delineation is still subjective. It's what you've remembered to calculate, it's what you've learned. It's never escapes. It's what I want to say to astrologers too. It's like, it was really interesting for me because so many people, for instance, with Jeffrey Cornelius, have said, a feeling of profound impact from what he shared with us. And yet what we teach about is mostly still just the technical side of things. We don't as much teach about what is symbolic process, and how do we engage the subjective skillfully in the process of astrological consultation or sharing of astrology in whatever, modality. Um, and that's, I think, what in a rigorous approach to experiential astrology is specifically asking that question. How do we engage the subjective in support of meaningful astrology? How do we work with that? How do we attune the consciousness of the practitioner? How do we assist the receptivity of the querent or the client? That question remains, I feel, relatively underexplored in astrological ways of, it's just not what people talk about. They talk about other things, which are also important things. But I have a deep desire to have more conversation about that question. And again, these experiential methods are specifically located at that part of the, if you feel that objective and subjective coming together is what happens in the experience of astrology, if that is something someone feels, then we need to really become more rigorous about how do we work with the subjective. And because otherwise it will come out the way it did in that person's experience, where somebody just sort of goes off and, is totally caught in their own material, but doesn't even know it, and, presents it as if it's astrology. It shows no self-reflexivity. I think when you work experientially, you develop a habit of asking about your contents, all of your contents, your opinions, your feelings, and then it also asks, like, what is the most effective way that I use that word divination more coming from Cornelius than maybe people would popularly use that word. But to understand, what makes that available, what makes that possible. And so I guess what I would say is, like, I'm kind of now speaking of, there are experiential astrology techniques, but there's also like an experiential astrology theory of the case, or an experiential astrology way of seeing astrology that isn't all just about the techniques we do, like role play or dream work or art, but it's also just a lens that really really seeks to track full consciousness engagement of both astrologer and client or querent or group or whoever student, and that's the and there is good thinking on that. There is thinking on that, but it's not. It's the anyway. That's part of the conversation I want to help us have more of. And I do think there's still so much to come forward from. I was reading your transcript of your interview with Jeffrey Cornelius, and that whole question of subjective, objective, and the way that nobody really has the answer about, in the sense of this. At some level there's an impasse between those notions of astrology, like more causal scientific, like explanations, and the more of this divination or of the moment. But that's still a really, I was reading your stuff and I was like, that is a conversation I am excited that at least sometimes some people are in. It's
Yeah, yeah,
under theorized, I think.
yeah. He was really trying to assert that I mean, he took it to maybe an extreme that not everyone agrees about, or I'm not sure that I was fully on board with that, almost at one point saying that there was perhaps no objective astrology, there is this subjective component. But that's the part, maybe without taking it to the full extreme, that I think I agree with and was reflecting on over the past week, was that there's always a subjective component when you have an astrologer involved to doing astrology.
Mm.
And it's important to be conscious of that, because no astrologer can completely divorce their astrological
Hmm.
knowledge and wisdom from their subjective experience of things. And so
Hmm.
sometimes it's better maybe to just be more conscious of that and to lean into it sometimes when that's appropriate, because there's a profound wisdom there when you can draw from that subjective side of things and balance that with the more objective or external side of things.
Yeah, I feel that. And I'm back to our lunation today, right? With Aquarius, Leo, like, that all in quality of fire, and particularly the Leo, participation, get in there. And then that capacity for detachment or discernment or systemic, like putting things into a larger framework. There's some sort of dialectic that's always going on there. And I wouldn't want to discard either, and I think, um, it's just in my own experience, it feels like that getting in there is really what I like to do. It's what I'm able to do. It's my contribution in a way, like to go for it on the subjective, and it does develop some powerful skills as a person sitting with clients in astrology. In the sense of um, feeling like you can go places that the person needs to go, and it's a different set of skills, right? Then there's a set of skills that's about delineation and really understanding the technique, and not just understanding the technique, but understanding its historical origins and understanding the natural sciences part of it. So there's so much there, and then there's a similar level of methodological process that can be brought to this other thing, rigor, I guess I would say, that you know is when those are married together. I think those are when those kinds of remarkable experiences happen.
For sure. And I like your thing about creating a container for everything and using the lunation cycle as kind of an analogy for
Mm.
the process of like warming people up, and then having the experience itself at sort of like the full moon, or acting things out in an
Hmm.
astrodrama context, but then also having a cool down phase and the
Hmm.
waning set of the lunation, where you're reflecting and like taking everything in,
Hmm.
in starting to process everything, I guess.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's something you're actually going to create a container for this year, because you're actually going to be having a conference
Mm.
for this type of astrology in October, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful way of framing that. I love it.
Thank you, thank you. I am great at transitions at this point.
I guess,
Tell me
yeah,
about
right.
the conference. Tell me what's going on with that.
Yeah, well, you can see I'm starting to smile already when you start to name it, partly because of how you did, but also, so yes, there's it's called the Living Astrologies Conference. It's going to be October 2 to 5 here in Santa Fe, and it will be a beautiful time of year in Santa Fe. It's all golden cottonwoods and golden aspen. Um, and it will be yeah, 4 days, and the heart of it, it's an entirely experiential astrology event, meaning there will be no lectures, there will be no PowerPoints. There will be projection for, the occasional charts and also images. But I do think one of the things is being allowed to get away from some of those things for the participants and the people facilitating. Um, so the structure of the conference is essentially that each day there'll be small workshops, meaning 25 max, probably more like 15 to 20 in each workshop. And that'll go for like 5 or 6 hours. So there'll be 4 days of those. So that's sort of the spine of the conference in a sense. So people get a really good chance to go into a particular topic and do some stuff. Then the other layer of the conference will be some large group processes. So one evening, for instance, will be playback theater, which is a form of psychodrama where you have a troupe of actors, just 5 people who just play particular things. And so people will use the current sky that day. We'll also use people's horoscopes. There'll be some live music that is archetypally inspired musicians. Then there's another night that we'll be doing sort of free dance with planetary prompts, kind of something I alluded to here, where it's not a structured kind of dance like move like this and move like that. It's you move as you will, but then you're invited, like, what are you noticing? And then you're invited, like, okay, let's move as your Mars, and and so on, and transit people. So there'll be some large settings like that as well. It's also, the words I've been using for this conference are embodied, so really being in the body's ways of knowing, somatic, sensuous, the felt sense, expressive, kinesthetic, movement. It will also be relational, and by relational, I mean, as we were saying before, it's not about talking about astrology. It's like, and talking about Mars, it's relating to Mars. It's not, again, the talking about will also happen, of course, but we'll really be relating to. And then it's also, again, there's an embedding part that we didn't, speak of as much, but there's so much about this is about being on the earth and located in here. So for instance, in this conference, we'll be visiting, we'll start on the land, and we'll start at the Santa Fe River, which is why there is a town here. And to me, that's kind of what we're doing with astrology. Is like, why do we have astrology? We have astrology because people were in touch with how they felt and what they were experiencing when a particular thing moved. They were tracking these things. And so we're kind of going back to the fountainhead, the river, right, of lived experience, around which a whole beautiful city of technique has emerged. And Santa Fe is all in for this. There's all sorts of extra things we're doing. We have private tours at International Folk Art Museum, which is an amazing place, and a lot of different parts to this. And Santa Fe has a really, a strong relationship with consciousness-oriented astrology. Dane Ridjar spent time here, Stephen Arroyo, right, Aaron Sullivan, Alan Oken, quite a few people who are consciousness-oriented astrologers, whatever we take that to mean, have been here, and also experiential stuff has happened here. Barbara Schermer has a great description of this huge tent that was erected right in the center of town, right near our plaza. It was a massive tent, and then they had little compartments, and they did what you described. They would run somebody's chart and then put people into each of the rooms, and the person would go around and so the planets weren't interacting with each other unless they were in the same house, but you would go around and meet the people in your different houses of your chart. So I don't think we're going to be able to construct quite that. But the workshops are many different kinds of, go ahead, sorry.
I wonder what year that was. That's interesting. I wonder if there's any like planetary repetition that's happening now with you doing the conference there now versus whatever that event was that she organized.
I've been trying to find out. I don't think it's in her book, the date. And
Mm.
but people here, Tom Brady, who I mentioned, who people know of this, but I haven't figured that out. I want to say 78, but which is an interesting year, right? From the Pluto, Venus, Mars a moment there where they were all together. So they were three of those Venus Mars conjunctions in like 78-ish.
Mm.
And Pluto hanging out there too in Libra. And so I want to say it's then, but I really don't know. But yeah,
Sure.
it's going to be a great event, and people, the workshops are the facilitators. People would know some of the names. Many people who've been on the podcast, like Aaron Fogel, Diana Rose Harper, and there's a lot of different methods that are offered. So yeah, and they're all, I think the beauty is the small workshops, like so you really can go somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, so not on Zoom. So you're actually in person for
No
a
Zoom.
that's wild at this point from the past 5 years, ever since the pandemic, and just
No.
there used to be so many more conferences and in-person events. People are almost not used to what that's like to actually meet up in person with a group of astrologers is a whole experience in and of itself.
Yeah.
And this is your first time doing a conference like this. It's called the Living Astrology Conference, right?
Yeah, living astrologies. We put it in the plural, which doesn't do well for search engines or whatever. But it is making a point, right? That 2 points being made by that. One of which is that this kind of work works with all forms of astrology, right? All modes of astrological practice can be engaged experientially, and indeed, we will have facilitators coming from many different backgrounds. The requirement for their workshops is that whatever they're doing can be people can orient to it fairly, to the subset of practice fairly quickly. Like for instance, this is an unusual conference in that you'll register for particular workshops when you register. So some will fill quickly when, just depends. But we will also, people will be sending out material beforehand so that you get the kind of educational piece ahead of time of like, what is diurnal motion? And, if that's Aaron's actually doing something on moving, following the diurnal motion and doing it with the body. And so there'll be some sort of orienting material ahead of time so that the time can be spent in the experience mostly,
Mm,
and
nice.
not lecture or, didactic. And so I think experience levels will vary about who's there. But I mean, look, I've been doing this. I was born into an astrologically fluent family. I've been in practice for 35 years. I still learn from every single one of these events. Like, you just can't not if you're open.
What's your background and how were you born into an astrologically fluent family?
Oh, well, I am from Appalachia, from West Virginia, and basically was born into a functional matriarchy. Like my mother, her mother, her mother, her mother, and we all were in the same house for a while when I was really little. And so all of them spoke astrology. My chart was done when I was born. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was probably the most proficient. And my great great grandmother was a tea leaf reader, and people would come to her from all over where we were to get their cups read. And they all spoke astrology. We were oddly also Christian fundamentalists, so that was a weird little thing. Um, but yeah, I was in it. And then when I was right at my Jupiter return, I there was a whole little cabinet in the basement of my grandparents' house that had all these esoteric texts. Alice Bailey, a lot of Dane Ridger was in there, a lot of theosophy stuff. And when at my Jupiter return, I found all those, but I wasn't supposed to open that cabinet. But I found all of those, and so I kind of jumped in the deep end. And yeah, it was funny thinking about meeting with you. I was thinking, oh yeah, how would I orient to like how would I say who I am? And I
Right,
thought
which I
about
which I should have done at the beginning. I'm doing this at like the last like five minutes of this interview, which I apologize for.
no, no,
Uh,
it's okay.
I meant to ask you what I'd ask people usually ahead of time what their level of comfort is talking about their chart placements. Some people prefer to keep their charts secret. Other people are very open. Where are you at with that?
I'm open. I don't usually have my whole chart out there, but I can share placements for sure. Yeah.
Sure. Do you share even like your, I don't know, your sun, moon, rising or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I'm a Libra Sun, Scorpio Moon. Cancer rising, and I have Saturn, rising right on smack on the ascendant. But probably most notable in or one of the more notable things in my chart is I have a Sun Pluto conjunction, right at the bottom of the chart, square the ascendant, and so part of what makes me feel like, oh wow, we're doing a thing that lots of people see into my house, like but yeah, no,
Yeah.
astrology's been with me the whole time. I think it's a little bit of why I am a little refractory to the notion that the technical knowledge will get you there, because like if I think of my mother and my grandmother, like they didn't know anything like what we do. I mean, none of them were practicing astrologers. My grandmother was close, uh but they knew it in their bones, like when my mother would say something connected to that, like there's a way that your whole body just like knows what it is. And so I think it has really is part of why I have this commitment to a lived experience, because it was more like folk astrology, right? It more like, hanging out with it. I live in a place where you get a feeling in your knee and there's a storm coming. It's that kind of, it's a little bit, more embedded in that way. So,
Mm.
but I started doing consultations for my friends' mothers when I was like 15, and I created this astrological board game that was sort of a Trivial Pursuit thing where you had to collect things for the different elements, and started to teach astrology. So it's been a lifelong, passion and practice. And but what I do love about this type of work, experientially, especially, I mean, I love learning new technique. When new things come, I kind of I look at it. I want to see it all. Um, but I also love this because you just get endless new images of the archetypes, endless new recognitions, and also fun, as you said. Yeah.
I love that. What's your Jupiter sign that was that transit, that Jupiter return?
Oh yeah, Jupiter is in Aquarius. It's actually being transited by Pluto this year. Jupiter 2 degrees Aquarius. Um,
Nice.
yeah,
That's
and
incredible.
trine my son Pluto. Yeah.
So it's like that was your original unlocking in some ways of some of that for you early on, and now
Yeah.
that same placement's getting amplified. You're hosting this big conference for the first time.
I feel it. Can I share? I have to share this story. Like my grandmother, my mother's mother, the one I mentioned, she was a Moon Uranus conjunction in Aries. So just to give you the feel, and so about, I don't know, 20 years ago, or I don't know, it was 2008 when Pluto was headed into Capricorn. I did my first kind of radio show thing here. We have a show in Santa Fe called Moonwise, which has been going on for like 35 years, public radio astrology show. And I was on it, and I sent her a CD, or maybe even a cassette, 'cause I don't know what it was here, but sent her a copy of the show. And in the show, I said what I told you, talked about discovering those books, and they didn't know that. They had never known that I found those, but then what my grandmother shared with me, we have the same degree rising in Cancer. And what she shared with me was that when she was 12, I think it was a bit more of an estimate for her, but when she was 12, there was this astrologer, Mr. Phillips, kind of the local town eccentric, who did everybody's chart. He's the one who did mine when I was born. So this astrologer, Mr. Phillips, this would be like the third, yeah, like early 40s, late 30s. So he would like she would be coming back home from school, and tell, be late. And what she would do is she'd detour to Mr. Phillips' house, and she would, knock on the door, and he would make her wait on the porch until he put on his three-piece suit and set out his table, and then invite her in, and he would give her astrology tuition. So she did the same thing I did, of this sort of like secret deep dive into astrology at the same age, which we only realized, 20 years ago when she, heard me reveal this. So, yeah,
Wow.
one of my favorite stories.
I love that. So you have this whole like family lineage with these different forms of like divination. And that's really
Uh,
unique because most astrologers just like discover it at some point on their own. And sometimes their family even has like issues with it or something like that, or is not supportive. But to have
mm.
that background coming through your mother's line is really fascinating, really interesting.
Yeah, it's a wildness to it, where they were and what was going on. There's a wilder quality. Yeah, there's a very strong Uranus moon thing going through the fit. Not, I don't particularly have that, but all of the women that I mentioned, they've got various Uranus moon combos, which I feel has a lot of connection to it. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love that. All right.
Yeah.
Well, so the conference, what's the URL for the conference?
Oh, it's Living Astrologies. Again, that's in the plural, livingastrologies.net.
Okay, I'll put a link to that in the
Thank you.
description page for this episode and below the YouTube video for those watching the video version. You're also speaking at Norwalk this year, right?
Yeah, yeah, I have a couple of talks, and I'm also doing a workshop. It will be somewhat of experiential. I mean, it's always a different animal when you're doing it virtually and in person at the same time. That's uh, limited, but yeah, it has a bit more on the mental health side of things, which still remains, important to me. And then
What's
I'm doing
the
like oh, sorry.
what's the title of the workshop?
I don't think I'm remembering the title just
Okay,
offhand to
the
be. Oh, I think
topic.
it's rewilding the psyche. Yeah, no, it's about actually working. I'm sorry, now I'm remembering. It's about working with the different parts of the chart, like creating space for different animals in the psyche to come forward. I use this ecosystemic metaphor quite a bit for the psyche, for the human psyche, that we most of us have a situation that's quite similar to the one we have in the world, where one species has decided that it is above the others and is kind of running things. And I find that with the horoscope, that's frequently the case. Certain planets are kind of empowered and identified with and kind of running things. And how do others, get to also be part of this? Because it seems like they're all in there, they're all part of the ecosystem. So it's really creating habitat for them. And then I'm doing a talk on underworlds and the notion of the underworld relative to Pluto. That's there. And then I'm doing one on relocation astrology using the relocated chart, which I do a lot with, but never have taught on. So I'm excited to bring that. It's a psychological mode of talking about it. It's not about like, choosing where to live. It's actually more about where do you live and how do you use the locational chart to live there? Because most people don't choose where to live anyway. They get displaced or they go because they've always lived there or whatever. So it's more of it's what I hope astrology is all about. It's like, how do we reweave ourselves in relation with our world? That's my entire interest in astrology. So
Nice.
anyway, so,
I love that. So sorry, I know you were running out of time. So the last thing is just you have do consultations on your other offerings are available on your
yeah.
website. What's your URL?
It's jasonholley.net, and the Holly has an E in it, Holley. And yeah, I do consultations, and I do these experiential classes I alluded to. So these are where we have multiple sections, but small groups, like 12 to 14. So for instance, I have one coming up on the earth signs. I've done the elements of a couple around and round or so. So the kind of thing we do is we'll meet weekly for like 2 hours, 2.5 hours each time on Zoom. And but so I share a lot of I've done a lot of work with the mythology of the signs. So I share a lot of my work. I share a lot of other work on the myths and the stories. Um, but then the way we spend our time together is experiential process. So for example, we want to look at the evolution of the Capricorn myth, where it moved from being like the goat fish to the goat. And then maybe we'll do that with our bodies. We'll imagine moving as a goat, and then you get your fish tail back, and then the tail is amputated, which is what happened historically with the archetype, in which you can also see microcosmically replicated in Capricorn people, where they've amputated their tail. They're just all climb, and so we'll do things like that engage the full body in it. People make art and bring the art, which Zoom is great for art because you can put it up and everybody can look close. Whereas in an in-person group, it's actually harder.
Hmm.
Um, Psychodrama, or sorry, astrodrama. Anyway, the point being, yeah, I have these different classes that run like that in online, and then I have a couple of retreats coming up later in France, and I guess maybe one here. Oh, and it's something in the UK. Yeah, so there's stuff. It's all on my site. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, people can check that on your website, which is jasonholley.net.
Yeah.
I could talk to you all day, but I know you have an appointment in like 10 minutes. So I want to
Yeah.
respect your time and cut it off. But thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really amazing. And I'm glad we did this discussion, this episode.
Oh, thank you so much. It really does feel good. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly Electional Astrology podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, and Berlin West. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. Their in-person conference is sold out, but you can still register to get a virtual ticket where they're going to stream the conference simultaneously online in May, and you can register for that now through their website at norwalk.net.